Thanks everybody for coming. It's good to have an audience. If you could please silence electronic devices this time, it'd be helpful for us. Cell phones, laptops, if you're working, whatever you got going on, just put it on silent. Heather, would you please call the roll? Here? Okay. We're going to move into our public comment period in a minute, but I was thinking, since the last meeting had a lot of people, some faces that maybe hadn't attended before, I thought I'd give just a brief explanation of the Planning Commission's role and what we do. I've done this before when we have an audience, just for the benefit of everybody here. So just so everybody's aware, the Planning Commission is an appointed body. We're appointed by the mayor. There's 7 members. We have 2 absent members today. We're a recommending body, so we are not a decision-making body. We make recommendations to the city council. We make recommendations to the planning director and the planning department, and those recommendations are then acted on by other bodies. So we're here to just provide our recommendation to council, who ultimately makes the decision. Members are appointed for a 4-year term and can serve 2 terms, and all our meetings are audio taped, and sometimes they're televised. I'm not sure if this one's televised or not. It sounds like it is. And we always provide a public comment period at the beginning of the meeting for people to talk about things that aren't on the agenda. And then we try to take public comment on the agenda item at every meeting when we can. And so with that, I'll kind of lead into the public comment period. We don't have any minutes. Typically, we would approve minutes at this point, but we don't have any minutes to approve today. So we're going to start with our public comment period. This is for discussion of anything that is not on tonight's agenda. Tonight's agenda item is the accessory dwelling unit ordinance update. So if you want to talk about that, there'll be an opportunity later. But right now, if you want to talk about anything else, you have a chance to come down to the mic and share your thoughts with us for 3 minutes. And if you do that, state your name and address for the record. Is there anybody who would like to speak about anything that is not on tonight's agenda? Yes, sir. Come on down. And I will give you a heads up when you have about 30 seconds left.
My name is Hill Cummings. I live at 1517 Texas Street, apartment number 24. I live in the 42nd District. I've been in this town for about 30 years, and I just want to make sure that we all are on the same page and know that we have done a lot of talking about the problems, and we've done a lot of talking about solutions. There's a lot of groups in town. There's a lot of efforts like your own. There's a lot of groups and people in the audience who are doing things. And I think it's just really important that we really focus on solutions and alternatives to what we're doing now, because obviously it's not working. And I think we need to change things and allow things to be different. But being a longtime resident, I know how they have to kind of be the same. But we have to allow for differences. And I just want to applaud everyone who comes here and everybody, all your attention and all the things that are going on in this city. And I think the zeitgeist that's going on right now about all these issues, about things about housing discrimination issues and all these other things that people like myself and other people are involved in, the time is now. And I think that with our upcoming legislative things that are going on, that's beyond the scope of the city, but there's a lot of things like housing discrimination issues. There's a lot of things like just cause evictions. There's a lot of things that are going on about all kinds of housing funding and stuff that it's not going to happen in our legislature, but it's going to happen by cities like our own, like Spokane, like Vancouver. And I just want to applaud you, and I just want people to think of solutions and not dwell so much on the problems. We've done enough of that. We've had lots of groups and explored things, and we just need to focus on solutions.
Thank you. Does anybody else would like to comment on anything that is unrelated to tonight's ADU ordinance? All right. Seeing no one, we will close the open public comment period and move into our work session. And so this is a continuation of last month's work session on ADU ordinance update. At the last meeting, staff presented information on general ADU ordinance changes and also Happy Valley Pilot Program. And then we took some public comment and had some discussion, and staff's prepared an addendum staff report. And Greg, is the intent to kind of present on that first?
Yeah, I think the intent, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, Greg Ockett, Planning Department, is to go through and get your recommendations on the potential changes that staff has recommended and also the changes that the commission has discussed up till this point. So we'd really like to get some direction on those items, and hopefully we'll be at a point, if the commission is comfortable at the end of the night, to go ahead and go away and prepare an ordinance that would make those changes and bring that back to you for a public hearing tentatively scheduled for December 7th.
December 7th. Okay, so we've had one work session on this. This is a work session. It's different than a public hearing, just for the benefit of everyone to understand. A work session is an opportunity for, primarily for the Planning Commission members to work with staff to ask questions that we need to ask and get answers from staff and debate where we stand as a body on this particular issue. We try to take public comment at every meeting. That's something that I think is really important. We've done that in the past. We're going to listen to the staff presentation, and then we're going to go through our dialogue tonight first so that we can make sure that we have an opportunity to fully vet this out and discuss it and make sure that all the planning commissioners get a chance to air their thoughts and ask questions they need answered. And then after that, if time permits, we'll take public comment. We will be ending this meeting at 10. So the amount of public comment opportunity that we have tonight is going to be dependent on how much time the Planning Commission needs to discuss this. And as Greg noted, after this, we will be having a public hearing. And the public hearing is a different kind of meeting. It's entirely focused on hearing from the public and the public's opportunity to comment on this topic. So at that meeting, we will take public comment pretty much exclusively. If there's time left over at the end of that meeting, it's kind of a flip-flop, then we might spend some time debating that public comment, but we will focus on hearing from the public at that time. The record has been open this entire time, and it will remain open. We've received a ton of written comment, and I think we all really appreciate written comment. It gives us a chance to digest that and think about it and absorb it. And so everybody continue to comment in writing. Whether or not you speak at one of these meetings, please continue to comment. I think that's fine. In writing, and that will remain, Greg, that will remain open straight through, right? So you can continue to provide written comment, and we will get to some oral testimony tonight. And it sounds like that public hearing is tentatively scheduled for December 7th, so everybody keep that on your calendar. We will not be making any decisions regarding our recommendation at that public hearing. We will then have a follow-up meeting to further discuss the topic, the public comment that we do receive, and then make a recommendation in a follow-up work session. So I don't want anybody to think that that public hearing is going to be the last meeting for the Planning Commission on this topic. I don't envision us voting. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris. We can get started, and then we'll get into our debate.
Okay, thank you. Chris Cook at the Planning Department. And we don't have a presentation. We did that at the last meeting. And so this one, the intent here was we were just going to launch straight into reviewing staff's proposals and getting direction from the Planning Commission on those.
Okay.
And so in the packet, attachment 2A starts with the summary of changes proposed by staff. And so I've put those up on the board up here. And so the first one right there is we're proposing to consolidate the standards. Right now, the standards for accessory dwelling units, attached, detached, carriage units, they're in 3 different places in the code, and they're referenced in many other places. We're looking to consolidate all of that into one section of the code and then clean up other sections, and then also standardize the language and clarify whenever it's possible to minimize conflicts in standards and language.
So we went through these kind of point by point at the last meeting, Greg.
I just wanted to add that when the ordinance comes back to you, we'll show all of these changes in legislative format. So you'll be able to see exactly what's being changed. This is sort of a general description of what we'd like to do. But when the ordinance comes back for public hearing, you'll have the exact language in front of you.
And do you envision that in like a track changes version of the existing AD ordinance, or like kind of an entirely new replacement where we could go look at the two next to each other?
I think it will depend on the extent of the changes. We like to show it in track changes if we can, but if for instance, if we're moving one whole section from one part of the code to another, we might show that as, and we'll identify it as, this is not a change in the language or the requirements or anything, it's just being moved from one section to the other. So we'll try and help both the commission and the public track these things in whatever format we think that'll work best.
So I just want to talk to the planning commissioners real quick. When, at the last meeting, we had kind of this preliminary discussion about how to tackle all this, because we had we had broader questions, broader issues to discuss, and then we had like specific content. And I think what Chris and staff are looking for is feedback on, specific content changes, and that, in a sense, presumes that we would be moving toward a draft ordinance. And I think at the last meeting that we kind of indicated that was the direction we wanted to go, was move toward an ordinance. But I don't want that to preclude any member from feeling like they want to talk about like bigger picture issues, right? We can still continue that discussion. I mean, a lot of the commentary was on bigger picture issues. So I kind of ask, I guess, I think you asked this at the last meeting, Iris, was like, what do we start with? And is there a desire to talk about broader issues first before we kind of get into these specifics? Lisa?
I'd like to talk about the specific points here and then have the ability to digress
Go
into the
back.
broader
Yeah.
issues where it's applicable.
I think that's the best approach. Okay, thank you. So that's good. So, because some of these are pretty basic. Okay, with that, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So, Chris,
Okay.
sorry.
And so that first one, is there any specific direction, or do you feel that we can move on to the next item?
Do you have any comment on this particular item? Mike?
Is 35, 90, and 100, is that just attached, detached, and carriage, as you mentioned? Those three
Yes.
sections? Okay.
Yep.
So,
And 35 is, yes, you're right, the attached and the carriage and the detached ADU, yes.
so that would just, if this did move forward, the infill toolkit section of the code would be altered to remove ADUs.
Repealed.
It would repeal the ADU and the carriage house sections.
Right.
So you would no longer utilize that if you wanted to do it.
Right. The standards for those ADU types will not live in the infill toolkit. They will live in a separate section of
Whether-
the code for all ADUs.
For all
attached
zoning
to-
too, whether you're in a residential single or residential multi-zone?
Yes.
Okay. Lisa?
Will you be taking some of the information that is in the toolkit that applies to ADU and then move it over in part of the commentary?
Yes, that is the intent, is to take whatever, basically repeal what is in the infill toolkit and move it and consolidate it with the attached accessory dwelling unit standards.
And will we have the opportunity to modify some of that if we feel there's a need?
Yes, we will come back to you with a draft ordinance with the specific language, and you'll be able to take a look at that and make recommendations.
Thank you.
Second item is concerning minor modifications. We're proposing to amend language allowing minor modifications it's in the infill toolkit. So it applies to all housing types in the infill toolkit in Bellingham Municipal Code 2028. But again, being there, it applies to the carriage units and detached ADUs. And so we're looking to modify that language to give us a little more flexibility in project review. And also, since they don't currently apply to attached ADUs, and we're looking to consolidate all the standards, that those minor modifications also be allowed for attached ADUs.
Chris, can you give us an example of what like a modification might be? Lisa, did you have an example you wanted to float?
No, I was going to say along with, my question was on more flexible and useful. Are you talking about the language being a little bit more flexible or the ADUs being more flexible?
The language being more flexible so that, for example, you have an existing detached accessory building on a property that was built under, legally built under city standards. And those standards currently today for detached accessory buildings allows you to build up to a property line. If the standards for accessory dwelling units don't allow that, but somebody's proposing to convert that existing building to an accessory dwelling unit, a detached accessory dwelling unit, we could consider that because they are reusing an existing building instead of needing to pick up that building, move it over 5 feet or however the distance is to make it comply, or leave that building in place and build a second building that complies. So now they have a primary residence, detached accessory building for a garage, and then a detached accessory dwelling unit.
Like another example could be if you had an 817 square foot structure and the code only allows a structure to be up to 800 square feet, maybe you could get a modification to an existing structure because
Yes.
it's slightly something like that. And there's standards that you're going to be incorporating or criteria
Criteria, there will be specific criteria.
that we can review.
Yes.
Okay.
Do you have any examples that aren't bringing an existing building into code compliance? That's like for a new construction, minor modification?
I have one. Just because I've done some infill toolkit projects where a house is situated, an existing home is situated on a lot in a unique location, and it precludes, say, locating an ADU where it would be compliant with, I don't know, maybe the house is in the very back of the lot, and the ADU would need to go in front of it or something that wouldn't be consistent with the regulations. So that's like an existing condition being the existing developed condition. That's happened using the toolkit before.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Something-
Site-specific needs.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, and so this third one, where they're allowed, staff's proposing that they be allowed in single-family zoned areas on a per neighborhood basis by legislative action. And that's what's being proposed by the Happy Valley neighborhood. Otherwise, we're not proposing other zoning changes to where they're currently allowed or prohibited. Now, at the last meeting, Planning Commission gave us direction that you would like to look at allowing them citywide in all single-family zones. And you also asked that we bring forward information showing what that could potentially look like. And so we put together some maps for you. So currently, they are not allowed in most single-family zoned areas. We might need to turn down the lights a little. Well, actually, this screen and this one right here are the best ones. That one's a little, it's not as resilient or brilliant. The first map shows all zones that currently allow detached accessory dwelling units. Those are multifamily zoned areas, commercial zoned areas, and then those areas that were annexed after 1995, and those are single-family mixed zones. And those single-family zones, actually it shows up in the next map, are primarily up in the north. You do see one down here by U Street. And then this is the former Department of Transportation site on Sunset. And that is a single-family zone that allows a mix of some infill toolkit housing types, including detached accessory dwelling units. And then the others are urban village residential transition areas that allow detached accessory dwelling units and carriage units. So on this map, it shows that in those areas, potentially 520 existing single-family or vacant lots could accommodate a detached accessory dwelling unit. In the urban transition, and this is something that we'll discuss later on in the meeting, if the minimum lot size for doing a detached accessory dwelling unit is reduced from greater than 10,000 square feet to 5,000 square feet, in these areas, you could then add an additional 220 detached accessory dwelling units. You pick up additional 220 lots. So if, under what Planning Commission is exploring, if it's proposed that detached accessory dwelling units be allowed in all single-family zoned areas, these are those single-family zoned areas. And so you can see the difference, actually, from right there, that is the net increase in single-family zoned areas. Now, drilling down a little lower, if we look at the lots that would potentially allow detached accessory dwelling units, if we just use the existing regulations that a lot had to be larger than 10,000 square feet, have alley access or access to more than one street, such as a corner lot, that results in an addition of 9,300 single-family lots, whether they're currently vacant or developed. And with this analysis, keep in mind that this is a very, very broad stroke. This isn't taking into consideration critical areas, where a house is currently located on a property, if it's even possible to get it on a specific lot. So this is just looking at everything.
Sorry, Chris.
Go ahead.
Can you clarify that a bit? Because, your presentation makes it seem like we're talking about subdivisions and creating lots. And what you're talking about is potential sites that could house an ADU that would have the amount of square footage on the lot and the sort of prerequisite requirements. But we're not talking about creating additional lots.
We're not talking about creating additional lots. These are existing lots.
We're just talking about an alternative housing form on an existing lot.
Right.
Yeah.
And, with that in mind, again, we'll back this up. All the colored land masses here, all the commercial areas, residential areas, you can currently do an accessory dwelling unit. And in over 20 years, we've had just 104 or 107 units. So even though we're saying, there's thousands of lots available, under current standards over the last 22 years, there hasn't been a windfall of ADUs being built in the city.
You just said in all those yellow areas, it's all residential single zoning. You can do an attached ADU
Right, but
today.
the colored ones that are faded, those are the commercial zones.
Yep.
And multifamily zones, you can do attached ADUs there also.
Yeah.
And so, again, throughout all of those areas that are colored, over the last 22 years, just over 100 have been built,
Permitted.
permitted. There we go. So again, this is looking at the potential number of additional lots if you allowed detached accessory dwelling units in single-family zones. This next slide is if the minimum lot size were decreased from the 10,000 square feet to 5,000 square feet, we could pick up an additional 2,900 lots. And you can see that some areas have higher concentrations of others. Lettered Streets has a large predominance of no alleys. Happy Valley has several blocks with no alleys. Up here in Whatcom Falls and this up here in the Roosevelt neighborhood. So there are a number of areas that will see a higher concentration. If we look specifically at the lettered streets, if you use the existing standards, if using the existing standards and they're applied to single-family zoned, you can see all the corner lots that would allow a detached accessory dwelling unit. There's only a couple of alleys in that neighborhood, and that's represented by the dashed lines. So every lot would be eligible for a detached accessory dwelling unit. If the minimum lot size were reduced to 5,000 square feet, then you pick up many, many more lots.
What's the, pardon me, what's the portion that's not in the black line? Is that multifamily zoning?
That's multifamily and commercial. You got the police station down here and health department and so on and so forth. And so, again, going back to the slide that we showed you at the last meeting, these are approved accessory dwelling units as of May 2017, showing the distribution across the city. There is a higher concentration on South Hill, but again, in 22 years, for all those areas, including commercial zones and multifamily zones, this is the total number that have been permitted.
Thanks for those visuals, Chris.
Can we get that PowerPoint emailed to us?
Yes.
Thank you.
I didn't want to send it out early because I wanted to be able to explain it first. And
Yeah. Could you guys have comp plan maps that show the distribution of uses within each neighborhood
yes.
with color, right? Where like, even though it's within a residential single neighborhood, there's like a color pattern for the different types of uses that are occurring in there or today.
Yes, and it's not a comp plan. It's a just a land use map.
In each neighborhood. Could you have someone send us those as well?
I can provide you the link to that.
Either the link or maybe just all of them in a single PDF or something so they're easily accessible. I was thinking about that and I wanted to look at them and I don't want to have to dig around every single neighborhood to find them.
Yeah, we have them in a convenient location, but
Oh, like
we
that.
have one for Happy Valley.
There you go.
We'll be talking about that a little bit later. But
Okay,
yes,
well, maybe I'm
this is
jumping
what
ahead.
you're talking about.
Yeah. I think it would
We
be
do.
nice to get those for the single-family neighborhoods that are affected by this. So any discussion on that big topic we talked about last meeting? Well, we did.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that direction was the direction that we gave, but, we received a ton of comment about it. No, I don't know if anybody has anything to say. I mean, just because we voted doesn't mean we can't talk a little bit. I think that we did direct that that's the direction we want to go. And I guess a question we have is, staff didn't really present that. I mean, this information is here, but, how's that going to be presented to council? I mean, how are you going to present? It didn't appear in this staff report, in my opinion. There was just a note that said, hey, Planning Commission made this recommendation, and then there was like no discussion of it.
Right.
Is there going to be a more substantive discussion of that from the staff perspective?
Yeah, we would, along with the ordinance that you would pass on to council, we would have findings, and those findings will explain the Planning Commission's recommendations and the effect of those recommendations.
So when you present an ordinance to us at the public hearing, it will be assumed that that ordinance we'd be talking about it in a citywide context.
Yes,
Okay,
unless you provide a different direction.
sure.
So like this attachment 2A that we're working off of here, the language doesn't look, under where allowed doesn't appear to have changed from our initial meeting. So this would not be part of the draft ordinance.
No, we'll make clear your recommendations. This was staff's proposed changes, is why we didn't add it
I
to the
see.
list. But yeah, we will make very clear all of your changes.
Lisa?
I assume you'll also be forwarding your recommendations along with that.
We always do, yeah.
So, that begs the question, where's staff stand on our recommendation? I mean, is staff going to recommend that we implement the Happy Valley pilot program and these changes to the, to just those areas that already have ADUs, or is staff going to, I guess, what do you guys think?
Well, I don't think we're ready yet to wade into that question with an opinion. We'll
Okay.
save that for the hearing or your work sessions after the hearing. But we will provide you with draft findings so that you'll be
Okay.
able to see how we've laid out the changes that you propose and the justification for those changes. And you'll have an opportunity to massage those findings so that they accurately reflect the conversation that you had and the recommendations that you made.
Okay. Anybody? Iris?
Yeah, I would just say, I think it's important to, and this was brought up at the last meeting too, to the different requirements and regulations that we look at putting into an ordinance, that whether or not this is an opt-in system on a per neighborhood basis using a type 6 process, or whether or not it's a citywide ordinance, would probably dictate a lot of the rest of our recommendations. And it seems like, at least in my opinion, that we should move forward more boldly and say we're either moving forward with a citywide ordinance or moving forward with something where we're putting together basically a pilot program on an opt-in basis that, in my opinion, would not be successful.
Sure. Lisa?
I don't fully agree with that viewpoint, because I do think that there's a lot of meat to the bones that get worked out, whether or not it's a case-by-case situation, or if Happy Valley goes forward, if it's successful and another neighborhood petitions through their neighborhood plan and update that they want to go ahead and adopt an ADU detached, the ordinance to their neighborhood. A lot of the decisions we're making, like setback and height and, whether or not we allow them on, based on the alley, all that stuff would be applicable and on books. That then would apply as situations evolve over time, whether the city decides, going forward, if the council decides to side with the recommendations, or city perspective, or planning's perspective, or a combination of the two. There's a lot of content here that I think we could move forward regardless of whether or not the staff is recommending for it to be adopted citywide versus just Happy Valley or type 6 process, or 5 years from now. Because, really, we are looking at hopefully setting up something that's going to be on the books for a long period of time for what can be developed. And so I think if we put that kind of lens on, we can get through quite a bit of this. And then some of the bigger issues, whether we agree to it or not, or if it has to go to the final hour and city council makes that final decision. I think, what's in the room is, are we, not everybody supports it going citywide. Some people do. And so I still think we can find common ground on some of the other characteristics regardless.
I agree. I actually find it odd that we have different proposals, frankly. I look at the stuff in the Happy Valley neighborhood that isn't consistent with what we're proposing in the other attachment, and I'm like, why are they different? Why would a pilot program have one setback and the citywide thing have a different setback, or whatever, different size limits? And that doesn't make sense to me. So for me, I just think uniformity, that's my biggest concern, is if with this whole piecemeal thing is, so we're going to have like 10 different neighborhoods with 10 different sets of standards. They're all different. That just can't work. But I agree with you, Lisa. I think like 99% of this is, we should be able to figure out, regardless of whether or not it's in Happy Valley or citywide, what we want in one neighborhood, we should want everywhere, in the broad sense. Not obviously there's specifics, but broad sense. So, I don't know. It's just odd to have two in front of us, and I don't really understand why they're different.
I agree partially. I can understand the Happy Valley perspective, because if they looked at their neighborhood, every neighborhood is unique. I think of the neighborhood I live in, the alleys are extremely narrow, so the alley access and the lack of setback is a major concern for me for safety, because I would want some kind of safety measure that there's not a bedroom on the alley, there's some kind of reinforced structure, because some of our alleys become speedways, and I just don't want to be putting living quarters right on an alley and having a vehicle go through that alley, go through that house. because there are setbacks for a reason, and to me, one of them is safety. So I would like to think that Happy Valley took a look at their topography, their lot size, the uniqueness of it, and came to the determination on some things that might be special. And I do think that, you know, there are certain things that could be broad stroke that could be applicable to every area, but as a resident in a particular neighborhood with very unique characteristics, I would want to be able to modify a little bit or leave something to the process where, you know, if somebody wanted to be able to, you know, utilize less setback because of a building situation that's unique, they could request that, and that could be looked at, providing that the modifications are within a parameter we feel is feasible and reasonable. Because I don't think, I would hate to think that going forward, we're all going to treat every kind of development like a McDonald's. No. And that everything's exact and we don't take into consideration the uniqueness of an area. I think we could have 85%, 90%, give good direction to developer, homeowners, what they can expect. But I, as somebody, if I wanted to create an ADU, I would want to be able to express the uniqueness of my location and ask for a slight modification based on that and show the justification and have that opportunity. So.
Thank you.
Greg,
Yeah.
when we get our draft ordinance in the coming months, is it fair to ask staff, when you make and develop your recommendation with regards to where detached ADUs are allowed, that you guys provide your reasoning?
Sure.
Given the comment that we've received, the testimony, the written testimony that we received, has been quite a pretty unique situation where we've heard from a lot of different individuals in a lot of different neighborhoods, and there's been quite a bit of support for the implementation of detached ADUs citywide. So if we're going to make a recommendation that that's not the course of action that we're going to take, we should have some good reasoning other than that it's difficult or unpopular.
Yes, your findings will have to represent your ultimate recommendation and the justification for it. And we would also, I think this is an important enough issue that we would also encourage one of the commissioners, maybe the chairman, to come to a council meeting and explain the recommendations and be available for questions.
Oh, Greg, is your mic on?
Oh, sorry. We would ask that one of the commissioners, perhaps the chairman, come to one of the council meetings and explain the planning commission's recommendations and the justification for them, and allow them to ask questions. We do that sometimes with controversial proposals.
I think we did that with the comp plan.
Yeah, and we did it, I think, with the waterfront too. It's helpful for the council to hear directly from you guys.
Well, I think Lisa's right. Most of this stuff is uniformly applicable. So let's move forward and maybe circle back to that issue a little bit later. Are we still the lights down?
We don't need them down right now, no.
Okay.
You can turn them up. Okay, you want me to continue?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So finish out number 3 there. The second bullet, the staff's proposing to remove the maximum 20 ADUs per neighborhood and 200 ADU citywide threshold. That right now is only in the attached accessory dwelling unit ordinance. That is not in the infill toolkit applicable to detached accessory dwelling units. So again, consolidating, and I think that it's been shown that attached accessory dwelling units, they aren't creating a great impact out there.
This is more of a concern, and I'm not sure where it would be addressed. I know in some of our much older developed neighborhoods that have housing on small lots that existed for 100 years, infrastructure for sewer and water is not always the best. We had a situation just down my street where a sewer had collapsed and had gone into housing. And I would like some kind of assurance that as we increase the density, because a lot of times when people are putting in an ADU, they're putting in additional bathrooms and such, that I believe the homeowners were going to have to pay for the new sewer line to go in, and City Council came in, Terry Borneman and Jean, and said that it wasn't fair and the city should find the money, and so those people kind of got off the hook having to do those repairs. My concern is that we increase this density through additional ADUs and we don't limit the number, we don't decide a dispersion that there's only so many per block. We could, especially around the university, have blocks that potentially, because of the high rental number in that area, even though we do want owner-occupied, I'm sometimes concerned about the enforcement level. I just want to make sure that there's some kind of assurance that the people who live in that area aren't going to be on the dime to make those infrastructure repairs when they start to collapse. And so I'd like to hear something from Public Works on areas that perhaps have not had updated water and sewer, and whether or not there's budget in order to make those repairs, and whether or not the residents and homeowners in that area are going to be responsible to make those repairs, or if the city will make the commitment because of the increased density to pay for it.
Is that from, okay, I want to make sure that I'm getting direction from the commission, and I know that everybody has their preferences on what they want to know, what information they need in order to make a decision. And so, again,
Are you talking about the public lines, like in the alley? Like, you have a private line coming off a house and it enters an alley?
Public lines.
Yeah, well, at no point would a neighborhood be responsible for repairing a public utility main, right, in a public right-of-way? That just doesn't happen. Yeah. I mean, like, the entire community has to pay for that,
Yeah.
right? But not that neighborhood. And then if a home were to redevelop, like Lisa's talking about with an ADU, and they had like an old junky sewer line that was from their the side sewer, you called it, is there a way to like check the quality of that, or is that on the homeowner then?
that is on the homeowner,
It's on the homeowner?
yes.
Would the homeowner be responsible at the connection point of that sewer, or just so many feet within their property would be their responsibility?
They're responsible from their home to the main, to the connection point.
I'm assuming the situation was the connection points failed for more than one house.
I know that the situation over in the York neighborhood is there was 3 properties. They had a private sewer across easement, across private properties. Instead of going straight out to the city main on the street, they went across their neighbors' properties to the street. And so when the one closest to the street failed, the next 2 lots up, they failed. And that was a private situation. And we have new development putting in, private CCNRs for private mains and stuff like that. That is the responsibility of the property owners. That is not the city's responsibility. So I just know that historic development, like in the York neighborhood, many of those were done without easements. They were just done on a handshake, and it was neighbors working together, building houses. The legalese of today didn't exist. So there are situations like that out there. But, we're looking at accessory dwelling units. When you build an accessory dwelling unit, it's the equivalent to a 1 or 2 bedroom addition to a single family home. And so the added demand on public infrastructure isn't that great.
Thank you for the clarification, but it does kind of beg another question. So in some of these areas where it was done on a handshake, where there's kind of a shared situation, I have the person next to me who builds an ADU, their system fails, but it affects my system connecting. Would then I still be on the hook to make those repairs?
That is a private matter. That is between private property owners.
Does anybody have any commentary, additional commentary on that concept of removing the maximums. Chris?
Say that again?
Oh, go ahead. It didn't look like anybody had any comment.
Trying to get this thing to...
Sorry, Lisa, I didn't see you.
I brought this up before, and I would like to know people's opinion on dispersion. How many, I mean, if, I keep thinking of areas around the university that if there's one on every lot, I mean, there's going to be areas that might be higher impact, and I do have a concern about the density levels in some of the areas that are small lot. So, I mean, I personally would like to see something that, if it's not necessarily a limit of numbers overall within a neighborhood or citywide, but a limit on, you know, a block radius, so that if you have 12 houses on a block, that all 12 don't have an ADU, because I do think that would have a strong impact on the characteristic and livability of a neighborhood.
Garrett and Iris have comments? Thanks,
Well,
Lisa.
I think this is a perfect example. Are we talking about a pilot program, or are we talking about a citywide ordinance? If we're talking about a pilot program, why are we talking about dispersion at all?
But we're not talking about a pilot program.
If we're talking about a citywide ordinance.
And that's what we decided last meeting. Yeah.
Well, it just seems like that we keep getting circling back to, you know, that, I guess that's,
For me, this is what I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
I don't see any difference.
okay.
If you don't want dispersion in one neighborhood, why would you want it in any neighborhood, and vice versa? You know, if you think dispersion's a good idea, then you should want it, you know, you shouldn't pick and choose who gets that benefit or not. So for me, I don't know. This is just where I'm at with this. I don't see a lot of difference between a pilot program and a citywide ordinance. The same issues exist no matter where you put this thing, generally speaking. Iris?
I'm hearing your concerns, and I'm hoping we can think of a way other than limiting the number per neighborhood or the number overall. And looking at the Sightline Institute's information on the many cities that are in their different ADU proposals and DADU proposals, and then looking at the impact on maps of where they exist. And there's no city where there is an issue of density in one neighborhood, or where that's come up as dispersion has come up as an issue. And I think the main issue that I have with putting any limit on a neighborhood or on the citywide or even on a block is that the people with the most money are going to build ADUs, and then the people who need the most are going to be there too late.
Mike, do you have a thought?
It's at the rate we've seen them built to date. It seems unlikely that any one block would get more than one or two in a 20-year horizon. You know, I think the worry is that if a single owner owns a number in a row, 3 or 4 in a row, and they were to do them all in one big block, so perhaps rather than a dispersion just in a geographic radius, you could sort of have a per owner proximity type limit.
But you can only have one per owner, because we're going to have an owner occupancy. I think we're uniformly in agreement that an owner occupancy requirement, oh, well, maybe not. We're not uniformly in agreement on that. But that if an owner occupancy requirement was in place, you couldn't have more than one.
Sure.
You couldn't proliferate like that.
So then that wouldn't be a worry.
Yeah.
My,
Chris? Hold on, sorry.
Yeah,
Lisa?
I was just going to say, you know, concerning the dispersion, you know, we had one project, Peabody Townhomes, that was 7 townhouses with 6 attached accessory dwelling units. When that project first came forward for the neighborhood meeting, there was a really good attendance at that meeting. A lot of people were concerned. A lot of people were opposed to the project. As soon as they found out at that meeting that 6 of the 7 townhouses were going to be owner-occupied, that fear went away. Everybody liked the project. And so that's a very high concentration on one half of a block all on one street face. It's the owner occupancy requirement that is making people feel, you know, good about it. I can say that back in 2015, we had the police department do an analysis of all the properties, take a look at all the properties that have permitted ADUs, and give us a report of, are we having problems with them? And we have not been having, as far as noise and occupancy and parking, we aren't seeing those complaints
From the legal ones.
from
Just
the
to-
legal
Yeah.
ones
Just to
that are
clarify,
owner-occupied.
those were attached ADUs, not detached?
On Peabody,
Yeah,
those were attached.
okay. And
Well,
the
for-
no,
standards-
some of them were in the carriage house. Some of them were detached.
By 4 of the 6 were over a garage, and how the townhouses were built, they had a wing that attached the main townhouse
Breezeway.
to the garage. So effectively, they were carriage units. They were only attached because they had this wing utility room attachment, basically, to the garage.
Did you have another comment? Garrett?
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about dispersion at our first work session, and, it wasn't included into these changes. I think that, when we're getting way too detailed and trying to predict and project where things may or may not be built. And, I think that concept of limiting specific areas to a certain amount of attached or detached ADUs is just not time well spent.
I've read through all these comments. There's been a huge amount of comment that we've received, and some that are firmly opposed to the idea in general, and some that are firmly in support, and then a large number in the middle that I felt like the content of those comments were, we're not opposed to detached ADUs as long as there's an owner occupancy requirement. I mean, that was like the number one thing we got. We're not opposed to it as long as there's an owner occupancy requirement. And also, we're concerned about our character of our neighborhood. And to me, character doesn't have as much to do with how many people live in your neighborhood as it does to do with what it looks like and feels like. And so I prefer, I guess maybe the approach Iris is talking about or something, I prefer an approach that regulates or controls that risk through solid standards for the construction. If you have 4 ADUs in a row, like Peabody, but they're all small and they're not too tall and they all have a parking stall assigned to them that's new and they all have an owner occupant and they don't tower or shade out their neighbor because they can only be 20 feet tall and they have setbacks, to me that's how we control the concerns that have been raised by the public, which is about these character concerns that have been raised. That's where I stand on it, is through a good set of development standards. That's how we control that issue. And yeah, I don't like picking and choosing who gets them, and I really agree with Iris on this idea of who gets to build them, because we had a gentleman speak to us about tiny houses, and he made a very interesting comment at the end of his comment. It might have been during the Airbnb discussion, where he said, the people who can afford to build these are not the people who need them. And if we limit it, I think you're right, Iris, the first people out the gates are going to be the wealthy people who don't really need that extra income or whatever, and they're going to eliminate the opportunity for those other people. So I don't know, that's where I fall on it, and I hope we can do a really good job of ameliorating the concerns that the public has raised about character through good design criteria and an owner occupancy requirement, and I know we'll get to that later. And enforcement, I'm sorry, I agree. I think in enforcement, Chris says the ones that are legal aren't getting the complaints, and I actually believe that because people are flying under the radar and cheating and having unsafe spaces, and so enforcement is an important component of the city's implementation strategy. I don't know if it's an important component of the ordinance we're proposing, but it's an important component of the implementation strategy. That's just my 2 cents.
Okay, so am I hearing support for no threshold, maximum threshold for the citywide ordinance? I see opposition from one, but not the rest.
How would we deal with that? I mean, do we need to,
Straw vote?
yeah, do we need to vote on it, or do we need to allow that discussion to occur more in the context of the ordinance that's drafted, or I guess I'm asking staff, but also Planning Commission. Iris?
I do wonder, This is obviously a contentious issue, and especially if we go for something that's citywide. I don't think that I'm going to get everything that I want from this, and I certainly see cities that have done in incremental steps. Seattle right now is looking at removing owner occupancy after having, I think, 10 years of having an ADU program. Vancouver, everyone's at different steps, and so I do wonder if there could be the potential for maybe putting something in another threshold where we review again and say, is this working? Are people feeling like there's safety concerns? Are people feeling like we could remove more regulations? And so I would be open to looking at the potential for another threshold like the one that was created. I think this one would be way too small, but I don't know if that would ameliorate some folks' concerns.
Lisa?
And I appreciate that because I keep coming back to the thought that when we open potentially the floodgate, it's really hard to bring it back in. And we started out with a pilot program to find out how successful is it. What are the pitfalls, what's successful, so that we can come back in the future, and if it's great and the data is there and hopefully there's a good way to measure that, then we can start applying it across the city. If people aren't knocking down the doors and, trying to, do a floodgate, I don't see the urgency to just blast it open and allow everything all at once. So I kind of want to be a little tempered going forward with the ability to adjust it once we know that we're not truly making a bad decision, because that bad decision is going to be impossible to reel back in, because as a property owner, when you purchase property, and we don't have a covenants, what is on the books for especially our single family zoning, you buy, I think of the water rights out in the county. People, got their permit for the well, but they can't put a well in. And so you tell those people, now you can't do this. Now that's a different game because that's through the courts. But, I know people myself, I invested into my home with a certain kind of expectation of what my neighborhood is like. I'm not talking about the socially economic because I'm not a rich person. I'm not talking about the ethnicity because we do have diversity in our neighborhood, but Bellingham is not that diverse for us to be able to cite, population pools not having opportunity. But I bought with a certain expectation of what my neighborhood is like and what that kind of livability is. And I know that there's adjustment and growth over time, but I just want to make sure that this is a wise decision and that we have the data as a community. Every community is unique, and you can look at other research done, but do they have 3 colleges? Do they have a large university? What is their employment sector like? How close are they to large urban areas where you have spillover? What's the speculation because of our recreation? I mean, we have all unique factors for why we have a housing issue. And I just want to be cautious going forward, not protectionist, not eliminating opportunity, and not saying we have to keep it the same. I do want to go forward with a good ordinance. I do think detached is a great option in the right place. Attached is wonderful throughout, I think, most neighborhoods as long as it's owner occupied. But I want to be cautious because this is going to be really hard to reel in 10 years from now if we found that this is very detrimental to the community and to certain neighborhoods, because it's going to be impossible to pull it back. I'd rather reel it out incrementally and wisely once we really have the data that this is a smart decision.
What's a reasonable way to address that issue? I mean, my concern with the idea of a pilot program when you start talking about testing it is what are we going to do? Are we going to wait 5 years and 10 people build them and then we don't have data? That's not data. That's like we just delayed an issue that we should be dealing with today, that we should have been dealing with previously. That, like Garrett said, people have been asking about since 2015 when we started this conversation. And we got a 2016 comp plan update where we committed to infilling in our city, not expanding outward. And that includes more than just urban villages. It includes everything in our city, every option we have available. And so let's say we take 5 years and we do a pilot program, we don't get any data, and now we're 5 more years into that 20-year planning period. And what have we gained? The potential negative impact for our community as a whole could be worse in that situation than it could be by a little bit of a proliferation of some of these things. That's my concern. is we don't get anything out of a pilot program.
And I agree with the data collection, because one of the charges in the comp plan was to do an assessment and inventory of how many ADUs are out there that are unpermitted.
It said
That
explore. It didn't
hasn't-
say
yeah.
do it. It said explore it. And we spent like a whole meeting debating that. I believe, I don't know the language exactly, but I think it says, Greg, do you know exactly what it says? I mean, I agree with you. We got to get that information. But I don't agree that that's a prerequisite for making changes in our city land use policy. And I know there's people in the audience who don't agree with that, but that's fine.
I have the language. It says, update one of the policies in the comp plan, update the city's ADU ordinance with priorities on evaluating and inventorying ADUs in the city, identifying appropriate areas for detached ADUs, improving permitting and enforcement, and requiring owner occupancy.
Yeah. So going through this process, we're accomplishing those goals, sorta. We do need to get more data. But the data component is something that we need. But again, I don't think it should be a prerequisite. But I don't know. Iris?
I guess it's funny. I think that we agree and for different reasons, and I think that's a good sign considering
Yeah.
where the community is at with this issue. I think we should go forward boldly, and I think that a reason to go forward or a safety net that we can have, and I think I would feel more willing to compromise on a lot of the issues that I wish we would move forward more boldly on, is if there was something set in of some type of trigger where this would come back to the commission to look at again for potentially changing regulations.
And that's kind of what Lisa's looking for too. Would that be a number or a date and time in the future? What do you think is the best way to address that? You know, like a number citywide, 5 years, 3, you know?
I would imagine it should probably line up with other ways that that's done within the city, whether it's when the next comp plan. I wouldn't want to create some sort of system that's not a best practice already for
Yeah.
reviewing things
So
like
the
this.
the attached accessory dwelling unit did both a year and a citywide threshold and a per neighborhood, actually, so it had 3 thresholds. The year did not work because they established it after, I think it was 2 or 3 years. And for people to come forward, get permits for the ADU, then get the building permit, then build it, that 2 or 3 year threshold was intended to have units on the ground so that we can evaluate what the build out was like. Nothing was built within the first 3 years. So that threshold didn't work well. It's the, the citywide threshold that is working out better.
If the majority of the commission believes that some sort of a trigger or threshold is needed, we could come back to you with recommendations on what that might be or what would work best. But that, of course, presumes direction from you to do that.
Iris?
One of the triggers I know that I've read a lot in the Seattle's planning process is that they hit 1% of their single-family units, or 1% of their single-family units has a detached ADU. It'd be interesting to find out, and I know data collection is very important to a lot of the folks in the community, to find out what % of our single-family units are occupied or do have a detached accessory dwelling unit, and then identify a percentage that we would have as be a trigger.
Do you mean what?
Especially because that would, a
Which ones are-
percentage versus a total number, like 200 seems kind of arbitrary if we have X percent more single-family units built. Maybe that a percentage might create more opportunity for more like a ratio.
Do you mean a percentage of the current number of detached ADUs?
No, percentage of single-family units in Bellingham that have an ADU, or detached ADU.
Today? Or after after I guess I'm not
maybe-
understanding. Like, if there's 10,000 single-family homes in Bellingham, we would revisit this at the time that 1% of those had a detached ADU legally permitted.
I don't know how, I think that part of that trigger would need to be determined based on the amount that we have now.
So that's like doing an inventory.
because we don't know that, yeah.
Yeah, but that would
It's an
preclude.
inventory of permitted, permitted built ones. So
Permitted.
if right now we have
We don't
this-
have any because they're not legal right now. So there are no.
We have 106.
Those are all attached. Every single one of those is attached, right?
Not all. There's
No.
a couple that
There's
are
a couple
detached.
that are detached?
Yep.
Oh, because they were in like infill toolkit projects or something. So yeah, that's the problem is the vast majority of them are attached because
Well,
they were.
you could have triggers based on attached numbers or detached numbers. or
Sure, that would be
permitted ones.
better. Yeah, that would be better.
And so you take a look at what we've seen in the last 20 years and project out what we expect so that that trigger comes into play 10 years from now or something, and it could be, you know,
I guess I
A
was just
percentage number
suggesting, I
for-
don't know what the percent
No, I
would
get
be,
it,
but
yeah.
a percentage versus a whole number, I think it would better look at density, or better articulate where we're at versus a whole number that seems kind of arbitrary.
Sure. Garrett and then Lisa?
The idea of a threshold, I think a time to come back and revisit, whether it's based on a number or a period of years, could be a really good idea. And it could be a good idea for a couple different reasons to look at it. I guess what's frustrating for me is we're talking about citywide ordinance. Staff hasn't given direction on which way they're going to recommend to city council, if this is a pilot project or a citywide ordinance. So we do all this work, we create a really great ordinance, and it gets reeled back and gets applied to one of our 26 neighborhoods. I really think it's important that we have some direction on how we're proceeding, and so we know a little bit, we could curtail our discussion to be way more productive.
Well, it's not staff's job to agree with us.
They don't have, but he just said, Greg, excuse me if I'm, that you're not committed to making a recommendation at this time.
Well, we made a recommendation. Those are the staff changes that we're going through right now. That was our original recommendation. Remember, we were updating an existing ordinance, fixing problems that we've encountered over the years with it. That was our original recommendation.
And the planning commission at the last work session asked you to go back and review the option of applying it citywide, not just a pilot program or one neighborhood. And we got back a document that looks exactly the same as the first document. It doesn't give any indication of whether you deliberated on that and said that's a good idea or a bad idea. So that's kind of what my confusion is. Where do we stand as a body that we're trying to recommend a good usable ordinance? And where do we have staff support going forward? Do we or don't we?
At this point, all I can say is that when it goes forward, staff will support the planning commission's recommendation. That's what we always do.
And at our last meeting, we voted that this would be applied citywide. I feel a lot more productive having these conversations when they have some substance behind them. If at the last minute, this gets reeled back to being a one neighborhood application, then a citywide ordinance that addresses all these complicated issues.
Well, we have to be, like Iris, I think, is we have to be bold in what we want to do. And just like with the comp plan discussion where we had differences on the growth projection, we ended up making a recommendation as a body that was different than the staff recommendation to council. And then staff had to present their opinion and our opinion, right, Greg? That's how.
Well, the only person that would reel it back here is the city council.
Yeah, so I think we should operate as if we are proposing that, and regardless of what staff thinks about it, because at the end of the day, if they don't like it, they still have to present what we like or what we collectively vote on to council, and they should do it in good faith and explain what we were thinking, and then council can decide. And it's not our job to predict what council is going to decide. We have to operate like what we think as a group, and we throw that out there into the world, and then council can decide if we're right or wrong. So I think we should just assume that we're moving forward with our ideas.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense. That's why I just want to be clear about how this draft ordinance, which we haven't seen yet. So we're going to have a public hearing when we actually see a draft ordinance. The recommendation from this body is requesting that the draft ordinance reflects that detached ADUs are applied citywide, and that when we have an actual ordinance, that it doesn't have something like this that says applicable citywide changes, that it's in a draft form.
I think that's what Greg's proposing to
Okay.
see. Yeah.
Then that makes more sense to me.
And last time, we didn't go through all these details in the final point as we're starting to do now.
I don't think so. Our
And so
discussion was much
I think
broader.
we should continue to go through this bullet point by bullet point and give our feedback as if we're making the recommendation that we want to make.
The only reason
So
why I
that it's,
bring,
like, we should cover all this so that it's our best face forward on what we want.
I agree. The only
comprehensively.
reason why I bring that up is we've had experiences in the past where the recommendation from this body hasn't been articulated in the way, in the form of a draft ordinance as our findings and conclusions were finished here. And when we actually saw a draft ordinance, it didn't look like our recommendations. So
Well, our job, I think, at that point would be to call that out and identify those. If we are presented with a draft ordinance that isn't consistent with any individual's or the collective body's idea of what we're doing or what we're proposing, then we have to make that point at that, either at that public hearing or at that work session that follows.
okay.
And then we have to give, I mean, it's our job to give clear direction to staff. So, you know, if we want them to represent a certain position, we have to be real clear about that.
I just want to be moving in a linear fashion with a goal in mind that we're all talking about the same citywide context. And I think we are.
Yeah. So in that context, dispersion is an issue, or revisitation, whatever we want to call it, is an issue that seems to be uniformly, there's some interest in that. And so at this point, we've had a couple different ideas. Iris's idea for percentages is a pretty good one. Do we want to ask, like Greg suggested, for them to come back with some thoughts on that and some options for us to consider?
I would support a percentage versus dispersion.
Some
'Cause
sort of
I do want things to be
revisitation.
measured
Yeah.
and have a revisitation.
And I think we should, I don't know, I know this is a really big issue. It's a big issue for me. It's a big issue for everybody. But we need to maintain perspective. There's thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of single-family homes in Bellingham. They're not all going to build ADUs the moment this ordinance is adopted. And if you believe that, you're probably wrong. It's not going to happen that way. Chris just said none of them got built in the first 3 years when we did the attached ADU ordinance, and those weren't even controversial, really, at least nearly as controversial. So the suggestion that there's going to be Pandora's box open on day one, I just don't believe, and we will have time to see how this plays out. It's just my opinion, but I really think that we should have perspective on that, because it's really easy to get all worked up about what's going to happen overnight and then make bad decisions based on that false prediction. So, Greg, can you come back to us with some ideas about that?
Sure, we'd be happy to.
Okay.
All right, moving on. So the next item here, number 4, proposal to reduce the minimum lot size required for detached ADUs from greater than 10,000 square feet to 5,000 square feet. And actually, let's back this up. So this is number 4, first bullet. And so currently, in order to have a detached accessory, in order to qualify for a detached accessory dwelling unit, it must be either on a corner lot, an alley, or basically a lot having frontage on more than 2 streets, an alley, or the lot must be greater than 10,000 square feet. Staff is proposing that the square footage be reduced to 5,000 square feet.
Sorry, just looking at the screen. Lisa.
At the previous meeting, I had requested sort of a breakdown of the different lot sizes in Bellingham based on neighborhood, and I didn't see that in our packet, so I did some additional research of other cities. I noticed in Seattle that they did a breakdown quite similar, and they found that 14% of the single-family houses in Seattle were between 4,000 and 5,000 square feet. And so I would suggest that we change the minimum lot size to 4,000 square feet.
Lisa?
I don't support that because of part of the goal within neighborhoods is still to have green space. And I just think, and it would be nice to know what is, the average lot size. And is this even an issue to go down to something like that? But I think if you have a lot of tiny lots and you're maximizing, especially if we're dealing, again, it is a little bit of what Gary was saying, what we're talking about. If we're talking about attached ADU, that's kind of a different animal than detached when your lot sizes get a lot smaller. And so that would, and if we're trying to have a uniformed goal here that applies to both, certain standards, I think I start getting into more concern about something 3,000 square feet having a detached ADU, but maybe not necessarily concern if it was attached. And I was wondering as far as what the decision making, and forgive me if I asked this before, I just didn't find it in my notes. What was the decision criteria to go from 10,000 square feet down to 5,000? That might help with an understanding of where that limit was based on.
Okay, so there's a number of reasons. One is there is no minimum lot size for attached ADUs. Most cities don't have a minimum lot size for ADUs. And so if you can already have a attached ADU on a 5,000 square foot lot, why can't you have a detached ADU? Citywide, we have a 30% open space requirement just in our standard single family zoning. That is, that's the open space, minimum open space you shall provide. And so that is in place. And historically, the city was platted out in 25-foot wide lots, 50-foot wide lots, some places 40-foot wide lots. In most cases, they were 100 feet deep. There's unique situations where York neighborhood, they are 40 by 112, I believe it is. And over in Roosevelt, they are 40 by 125. But for the most part, and then in the neighborhoods where the lots were 25-foot wide, the city adopted zoning that required lot consolidation. So even though you have two lots that are 25 by 100, 2,500 square foot lots, the city established zoning back in the early 80s that required lot consolidation so that you had to have at least two lots before you can build a single family home. So the zoning minimum lot size is 5,000 square feet. So whether you're in a neighborhood that was predominantly platted at 50 by 100 or a neighborhood that was platted at 25 by 100, the minimum lot size by and large is 5,000 square feet. And so that's where that 5,000 square feet is coming from.
So the likelihood of having much or significantly smaller lots is a very small percentage overall?
Yes.
Okay.
And we did show the impact of that change on the map so that you could see where they would be allowed on 10,000 square foot lots and where they would be, the change that would occur if we went to 5,000. And if there's another way that we can show that, that helps make it more clear, we'll try and figure out how to do that.
Garrett?
Yeah, so we've had a little conversation about a minimum. Is there anybody that thinks that 10,000 is not enough? Because I agree with the recommendation of 5,000 feet, and just my experience with different lot sizes in Bellingham, I think that anything smaller than that's a low probability. I wouldn't have any heartache of it being 4,000 either, because I just don't think the implementation of them on a lot much smaller, that would be, I don't think that 1,000 feet makes much difference. I think for a detached ADU or an ADU ordinance, I think a 10,000 square foot minimum is totally inappropriate. And so a reduction to 5,000, I think is great. And I'd be fine with 4,000 too, but I don't see those as being distinctly different.
Iris, your comment?
Yeah, I'm wondering why there needs to be a minimum lot size requirement if we have a 30% open space minimum for single-family units.
Again, we have the standard right now for you have to have at least 10,000. We are looking to relax that rather than eliminate it. If the Planning Commission wants to recommend eliminating that, we would be open to that.
That's that's an interesting discussion, because if you take a small bungalow house that's, say, on an existing lot that's 500 square feet, has a lot of open space, but it's on a 3,700 square foot lot, just one of those weird plats. Maybe an accessory structure that was 300 square feet could be appropriate. And that's an interesting discussion to have. I don't know that a minimum lot's got, you have open space requirements, you have setbacks, you have existing structures. That may, if it makes it more usable for one person to be able to do it, that might be worth looking into.
And it sounds like lots less than 5,000 are extremely rare.
It's pretty rare.
Rarer.
It would be
We can
interesting.
provide you with the
they're pretty
percentages.
Could we get that number? That
Yeah,
would be.
we can provide you with the percentages.
This is it jumps a few issues for me, because there's also this provision in here that talks about how big the ADU can be relative to the primary residence, and we'll get to that, but I mean, it's like a terrible idea, like someone in the public comment made a great comment that said, so you could have a 4,000 square foot house and you can build an 800 square foot ADU, and you get 4,800 square feet of developing your property, and you can have an 800 square foot bungalow, and you're only allowed to build a 400 square foot ADU. It doesn't make any sense, why not just cap it at 8 for all of them? 800, if 800 is the biggest enough structure, everyone should get that. 2 800 square foot structures on one lot is no more impactful than a 2,000 square foot house in an 800 square foot structure. So in the same, I kind of am leaning where you're leaning. It's like, who cares how big the lot is if we have if we have open space protections, and it also strikes me that I personally think an attached ADU is more impactful, because you're making a massive structure potentially. You're increasing bulk and mass on the site. Whereas if you have a detached structure, you have 2 smaller structures typically. And that, to me, feels better. If my neighbor had a 2,500 square foot house and wanted to add an ADU attached to it, his house would appear a lot bigger to me than if he had a cottage in the backyard. So
That separation is important. Visually, it's a different character.
It's totally
than a
different
bigger-
than like a big so I don't know. But that gets to me at the basis of the complaint. I don't see why a detached ADU is that big more of a deal than an attached one, because I personally think attached ones actually potentially create more impact on your neighbors, more impact on the appearance of homes in the neighborhood. So just generally, those 3 issues to me all tie together. How big are we going to let these things be relative to the other home on the property? Why are we making these restrictions on detachment, not attached, and then the question of how big the lot is.
Yeah,
I'm
I
okay with
was-
going to 5 because it's a decrease. I think it's okay, but I don't know. It seems some of these things seem redundant.
I agree with the redundancy, and then the challenges that is created by the redundancy if you're trying to fit this perfect puzzle of not more than this height and not more than this percentage of the house and this percentage of the land. It seems like it's really creating a restrictive system, especially if we already have things in place that are there for a specific intent. Like, yes, I can see being behind, yes, we want 30% of our lots to be green space. That sounds really important. But to have all of these different types of restrictions that are competing and on top of each other for the sake of having them, that doesn't make any sense to me. So I'd be interested in if there was a way that we could compartmentalize them and simplify them.
Lisa?
I'm comfortable going down to the 5,000, but not necessarily less than that, because I think there's a mechanism that, for the one-off, that if somebody had a 4,800 and they had a small bungalow house, there is a measure in there where they could request a variance to be able to show what that impact is, and that they have the 30% in size and scale, and be able to go ahead. I'm assuming based on one of the other criteria in here where there would be the flexibility, or am I incorrect on that?
You mean using that relaxed minor modification provision? It might be challenging. I guess an example I would give is back to the Peabody townhomes. Those lots, in some cases, the middle lot is 1,900 square feet. Lots on either side, I believe, are 2,400 square feet. They have attached ADUs, but they are effectively detached ADUs based on the design. They could have easily been detached ADUs if they just didn't connect the main house to the garage. And that's a situation in a planned, a planned development where it worked, and it worked well. And so they have shown that you can do it successfully, and it looks well on smaller lots.
And by consolidating the regulations, like you're suggesting, we would eliminate some flexibility within the multifamily zones effectively. We'd make it, that kind of situation not allowed. Is that the result?
If you propose to do away with this regulation, you would be simplifying the regulations.
No, I mean like right now, if you're in a residential multi-zone and it allows detached ADUs, there's no minimum lot restriction. But if we consolidate all the rules into one set of rules, they're going to apply uniformly across all the different zones. And so all of a sudden we would have a situation where a multifamily lot that was 3,000 square feet using the toolkit couldn't do a detached ADU because the lot's too small.
Right.
I don't think that's a good idea.
That's not good.
No, I mean, we're making it harder to densify the multifamily zones through this. That doesn't make sense to me.
So we're talking about potentially recommending removal of the minimum lot size.
I'm okay with, maybe this is one of those, for me, maybe this is one of those issues where we take a step and then we come back. I mean, if you go to 5,000 and you evaluate this for some period of time and then we come back with a percentage, that's maybe an item that could come up at that point to go further with.
If we get the numbers on how many lots there are, that might help make this essentially moot point.
But the issue I just raised is important, and I would think that we would have to add a comma here and say only in single-family neighborhoods. We can't have this provision apply in a multifamily neighborhood because you would eliminate the Peabody project from happening by doing that.
Yeah, actually, I just caught myself. Peabody, it's on an alley, so you could do that.
You could do it on an alley.
Yes.
Still, though, you see what I'm getting at, is I think we would have to add, in my opinion, we should add a sentence that says this 5,000 square feet is only in a single-family neighborhood. Lisa?
And I agree with what you're saying. I don't necessarily, and again, that's where I come down to, you can't, we're not developing, a fast food chain here. There may be some slight variances that apply to single family versus, if we go citywide with this, single family versus multifamily, because I don't want to eliminate the creativity of a multifamily. And new development is a different animal because people purchasing into that area, they know what it is they're getting. My primary concern is the established neighborhoods and how we fit this into it. And so, I'm comfortable with two different lot sizes, one for single family and then one for other zoning, so that we're not creating an issue there for the creativity in the multifamily.
Right now, there's none in multifamily, right? So if we just qualified this to apply to single family, it would maintain the status quo in a multifamily environment.
No, right now, this 10,000 square feet applies in multifamily also. This is the standard.
Then how could it, so if Peabody,
Is that why Peabody did attached? Because they
No, Peabody could have done it
Because it was on an
detached
alley.
because it's on an alley.
but, so you could go into a multifamily project that wasn't on an alley, on an 8,000 square foot lot, or if we change it to 4,000 square foot lot, you couldn't do a
Right.
carriage house or a detached ADU.
Right.
Iris?
But we can specify that the minimum lot size only applies to the single-family zoned areas.
That 3,500 or 4,000 square feet lots are not very prevalent in Bellingham, but I'd like to know a little bit more specifically, because if I would imagine that particularly some of the older lots in Bellingham would be potentially the smaller lots, based on my understanding of how of the neighborhoods, and so yeah.
just,
Idea?
I would just say, with our current development regulations, we're talking about site coverage. There's nothing that would prohibit somebody from building a garage that's a detached structure, or a greenhouse that's a detached structure. We're only talking about whether somebody habitates that space. So, I'm fine with 5,000 square feet. I'm fine with going to single family only. That makes sense. That shouldn't apply to multifamily. If it was gone, and it still is within our development regulations of open space and lot coverage, it seems unnecessary. That's
What I'm hearing
good
is,
information.
yeah, that there's support for 5,000, and so, but we'd like to get more information. So maybe we proceed with, your ordinance on that basis, and then you can bring back information, and then during the ordinance review, when we're talking about that component, we could talk with more information. We could talk about the issue a little bit further.
Yeah, we can show you the percentage of lots in Bellingham that are smaller than 5,000 and where they are. We can map where they are. So
Is
you'll
that
be able to
okay
see.
for everybody, Lisa?
Could you also identify those based on who have alleys, and this would not necessarily impact them? Because I don't want to see a large number, and then 90% are on alleys, and then
point.
they wouldn't be impacted.
Right.
Thanks.
Okay,
Greg.
we'll proceed on that basis
Okay.
then.
Does anybody have any additional comment on the corner lot, alley lot component of this? Lisa?
Just restating my concern about alley. Some of our neighborhoods, I know Letter Street, York, the alleys are incredibly narrow. And in my area, we have dead ends, and those alleys are used as a thoroughfare, and people go fast. Before they bermed off the alley that adjoined, basically, if you continued up the alley, you would go through my yard. They, on a Wednesday, because of people heading to the high schools, they put a traffic study in there, and there was something like 200 vehicles on a weekday, and they clocked people doing 45 because of the long stretch. I had more than a few people bust through my fence and end up in the middle of my yard. And so my concern is and I'd like more information, is what type of safety requirement would be needed if your dwelling unit was right up against the alley. Is there any kind of structural requirement? Is there bollards? Would there be traffic calming? That's probably not the best idea, because that just makes people airborne when they're going quickly. But I would like a little information about that, because I'm not comfortable entirely getting rid of the setback in those really narrow alley situations, because I do think it is a safety issue.
Thank you. A detached structure that's not an ADU, is there a setback from the alley?
Currently, there is, only when the garage doors face the alley, but otherwise, if the garage doors are perpendicular to the alley, they can move the building right up to the property line.
And that's because there's a 20-foot, is it 20-foot minimum backup distance that you need off of the garage door, or 22 feet or something?
No, there's a 22-foot minimum backup distance, to back up out of a parking stall. You can use the alley for that maneuvering, and throughout the city, alleys range from platted 12 feet wide to 20 feet wide. And so when that 10 feet is applied uniformly across the city on a 12-foot lot or a 20-foot lot, it's not being done fairly. It's taking away from people's property what they can't use it as efficiently as somebody that's on a 12-foot alley. So that is actually an item
Number
at the
8.
end of this that we
Yeah.
will discuss later, though.
Do we want to come back to that? At least that's number 8 on this list, yeah.
Okay.
It's an important question. But the question of allowing them, like the alley or the corner lot being a criteria for allowing them in addition, because right now there's 3 criteria: a size, an alley, or a corner lot. Does anybody have any comment on that in a vacuum?
I'm not necessarily against abutting an alley and not having a setback, as long as there's a provision for some type of safety measures. So I'm not saying don't allow it, but if we have a 12-foot alley, I would like some type of safety measure because we're converting possibly, into a living unit, and I just would really be amiss reading in the Bellingham Herald 12 years from now that a car crashed through someone's bedroom, and there was nothing there to prevent it, and it's a narrow alley. I mean, I just don't want that to be something we look back at and say we missed an opportunity.
Okay, moving on, number 5, concerning height. Staff is proposing to reduce the height limit from 25 feet to 20. This is for detached accessory dwelling units. And let me condition that with the second bullet, is that, you know, we're looking at this, 25 feet easily accommodates 2 stories and a roof. Currently, we have a standard in there that the height limit is 25 feet or the height of the existing home, whichever is more restrictive. So if you have a 1-story home, you cannot do a carriage unit. And so we thought it would be appropriate to relax that some, because single-family neighborhoods are predominantly 1 and 1.5 stories. You get 2 stories here and there, and they become more prevalent in the newer neighborhoods. It depends on where you're at. It varies throughout the city. But we feel that 1.5 stories is an appropriate scale, even when all the surrounding homes or majority of surrounding homes are single story. It fits in. And so we feel that reducing the overall height limit to 20 feet, but don't cap it to the height of the existing single-family home.
Garrett?
I mean, I played around with some heights and stuff on this, and you know, I think 20 feet's reasonable. I think this gets into the discussion of what's the primary structure and what's the accessory structure. What's the main living residence and what's the subordinate dwelling area, and that gets into the size of 800 square feet or percentage of size of the home, and so all these 3 things kind of are important to consider, I think, together. I think when you're talking about detached ADUs, we got to be careful about bulk and scale and size. So I'm comfortable with 20 feet. I think it's reasonable. I think you could have a nice 1.5-story structure, a 10-foot, if it was a garage, you could have a 10-foot ceiling height in the garage, which would accommodate a reasonable door. You could have a 8-foot dwelling area with some dormers. And I think the lower height limit actually will help increase the character and the quality of structure, because it's going to make it more difficult to put a box on a box with some trusses. It's going to help encourage, stick frame construction, dormers, shed roofs, which is what we see in our classic neighborhoods and and everybody's drawn to, that craftsman style. So I think it's a good change.
I agree. I think it's a good balance. I think it's a bit of a punishment. I mean, I live in the Columbia neighborhood on West North, and the 3 blocks north of me are all late 40s, bungalows that are 1 story. Every single house in the block is a 1-story house. I don't think a 1.5 stories in the backyard would destroy that feel, but those people would be punished if they couldn't go up a little bit. And so I agree. 20 feet keeps. Look, this strikes what I was talking about earlier about addressing character concerns and impacts to neighbors through the design standards. 20 feet's not going to shade out your neighbor like 25 feet will, especially if you're set back a little bit from the property line. And so I agree. I think it's a good balance, and I think people can make it work with 20 feet. Anybody else have thoughts on that? Lisa?
No, I agree, because I don't like the idea of a box on a box.
Yeah.
And I think of some people who have come before us and City Council where a very large structure was built right on their fence line and shaded their yard, and I think that's a big concern about detached ADU. So I think this will help, especially if you're prepared during the presentation to maybe show how that might look in a neighborhood, because I think that's going to be an important visual for people to be able to see the bulk and scale, and still working with the design standards, because even in your neighborhood where there's bungalows, if someone builds something above a garage and it's not the right setback and the windows aren't positioned correctly, which in the original report we went into a little bit more of the design standards about where the windows are placed, so that I'm not out gardening and somebody's like where the deck placement, all that's going to be
Peering out
really
the window.
important to show a couple of those examples.
That's a good point.
Okay, good. Just a check-in. It's 20 to 9. Any interested in a break? Is there any need for a break or anything?
Let's try and get through a couple more of these.
Okay.
I'd like to get through it so we can listen to
So-
people.
Number 6, concerning the unit size. So currently for both attached and detached, the size limit is 800 square feet or 40% of the existing primary residence, whichever is more restrictive. For attached accessory dwelling units, it does allow for a conversion of a 2-level home to just 50%, because if you have 900 square feet on 2 stories, to try to create 800 square feet, or if you have 1,200 square feet on 2 stories, to convert, it doesn't always make it efficient or feasible to leave like 100 feet to 300 feet as part of the primary residence on another level. So we're not proposing to change those elements, except for the detached, or for the maximum size of an accessory dwelling unit. We are looking to increase that from 40% to 50% of the size of the primary residence. And when it consists of a detached accessory dwelling unit, and that includes ancillary space such as a garage or shop or something like that, that 50% includes the entire building. And so when we look at that, and again, trying to promote efficient building, efficient use of space, you're allowed a detached accessory dwelling unit up to 800 square feet. You could build a separate detached accessory building on your property up to 800 square feet. There is no limit in the code on the number of detached accessory buildings you put on your property, as long as you maintain 30%. So in order to provide an incentive to consolidate, we're looking to increase that maximum size to 1,000 square feet, as long as the ADU does not exceed 800 square feet. If you want to go over 1,000 square feet, it would require a conditional use permit, similar to how it's currently operated for just a detached accessory building. If you're going to do a detached accessory building over 800 square feet, it requires a conditional use permit. But we're saying here that if you are going to consolidate and do an ADU and garage or some other ancillary space, you can combine them. You can do it up to 1,000 square feet. If you want to exceed 1,000 square feet, it requires a conditional use permit.
Lisa?
I'll just say I struggle a little bit with this one because of recognizing the potential of abuse. I understand, trying to consolidate so that they don't have multiple buildings, but I don't see a lot that would prevent someone from building something that's 1,000 square feet, saying 200 of it is going to be a utility shed, and as soon as inspection is done, they unlock that door and it becomes an additional 3rd bedroom. Is there any measure that the city can take in order to try to not have that become an abuse situation?
In a lot of stuff that we do, we look at it with, we give it the sniff test. And if it looks like it's obviously being designed for conversion, we call it out. But if it has a stair that goes to the outside, in order to get to that additional 200 square feet or so, you have to go outside to get back inside. That's part of that sniff test that we give projects like this.
I'd like to say I have confidence in that, but I know of a couple of boarding houses that had 2 bonus rooms that you could see the outline of the closets. And as soon as inspection was done, pretty sure that those closet doors went up because the owner is renting them as 7-bedroom by the room, and it was brought to, forward by the neighborhood. So, depending on the sniff test, is only as good as the person who's reviewing it and a city willing to back it up. So again, I'm not saying, get rid of it, but it definitely gives me pause. And again, from a public perspective, I would say that might be an area that might need some additional focus when it comes time to present the information.
Yeah, and again, there's those code beaters. This is one where, again, you can build as many detached accessory buildings on your property as you want, as long as you maintain 30%. You have a 10,000 square foot piece of property, you can cover 7,000 square foot of your property. And you can have your chicken coop, you can have your shop, you can have your garage. And there's nothing that's going to prevent somebody from getting that 200 square feet some other way. So again, we're trying to incentivize consolidation. And if it's in scale with the existing home, that overall this 1,000 square feet isn't exceeding 50% of the size of the primary residence, it's still, in appearance and mass and scale, subordinate to the primary residence.
And I understand that,
Yep.
which is why I'm not requesting that to be changed, but it's just a cautionary note that it is a concern.
Okay. Thanks.
I commented briefly on this earlier. I don't know why we're punishing people with small houses. To me, this acts, if you have a new vacant lot and you want to do an ADU, this acts as an incentive to build a bigger primary residence so you can get a bigger ADU. And I just don't know why we don't just say the ADU can be up to 800 square feet. Doesn't matter what the main house looks like. We can build an 800 square foot detached shop if we want, has no relationship to the size of the home on a lot. Why does it matter if someone lives in it that all of a sudden changes? I just think it's the wrong, and it incentivizes the wrong thing, which is people building bigger houses that they might not need. Iris?
I agree. If we say how big the ADU can be and how much of the lot needs to be green space, the only thing left is the house and anything else that someone builds on it and on their lot. And so it doesn't seem necessary to me to then also dictate the proportion the ADU, DADU needs to be to the house, and it seems like it could restrict functionality if you were a family living in a small house and you wanted both mom and dad to come live in a DADU that you were going to build in the backyard, and it could limit your ability to do so, and so I think it would limit functionality, and it's unnecessarily restrictive.
As long as it's smaller than the main house and smaller than 800, I don't see, I mean, you maybe set it at 90, so like it's.
That's a good point.
Smaller
so
than.
that's smaller.
It's
I
still
agree
accessory.
with that. Yeah, I think that's reasonable, and I do like the cap on the combined space that we were talking about, that Lisa was talking about, so that you couldn't take like 1,000 square foot shop and add an 800 square foot ADU onto it. That presents a problem. So, yeah, maybe I just feel like going to I think that the pilot program was proposing a 90%. That's what I'm getting at. Why are we doing 90% in a pilot program and not doing 90% citywide? If 90% is what makes sense, let's just do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I think what's important is that there's scale to the primary residence. And so if
That's
it
what
is
Mike's getting
smaller,
at.
then, you have a 700 square foot bungalow and you build up to 90% of that for your ADU. Those are
And that could
compatible.
include attached ancillary space.
Yeah.
So if your house was 1,000 square, or if your house was 800 square feet, and there was a 400 square foot shop in the backyard, that structure would be maxed at 90%, and that would restrict you a little bit. But then you would just go build it detached if you needed more space next to your
Now,
detached
we're
garage.
talking about unifying the attached and detached. I still see value of a smaller percentage on attached.
Unattached.
Yeah, but going up
Well, right now you can,
What is it right now unattached? Is it,
right now, is there a restriction relative to the primary residence for an attached?
Yes, there is. It's 40%, same as for detached ADUs, or there is the provision that says if you have a split-level home, you can convert half that home to an ADU for efficiency. So effectively, if you do that, if you have an 1,800 square foot home and you convert half, you are now at 100% of the primary residence, which is on top of the ADU. It is the equal size as the
You're allowed
primary
to do
residence.
up to 100%
If
if
you have
it's
if you have a
stacked?
90% restriction, doesn't that address the attached issue too? If you had an 800 square foot house and you want to do an attached ADU, it could only be 90% of that. And if you had a 3,000 square foot house, your max would be 800.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess most houses are.
You know, so I don't know. I didn't think about it. I didn't think about the
they should-
attached
I think
context.
those requirements should be the same for attached or detached, is how I feel. I don't think that,
Do you guys think lower than 90 is better?
no,
Just to be a little bit safer, or?
no, I just think that they should be the same. I think the important thing is to distinguish between the primary use and the ancillary use.
Lisa? Yeah.
This is an area that I can see an area of compromise, because identifying the goal that we really do want the secondary living area to be subordinate, especially if we're dealing with detached. I think 90% truly is not enough, because, you know, if you have, you know, a 900 square foot house and you're building an 800 square foot ADU, from the street, you're going to look like you have two houses of very similar size and scope. And so the ADU should be the subordinate on the property. And so I think 90% is a bit too generous, but I also think 40 to 50% may be a little bit too lean. If we can come to something where, you know, we're meeting the goal that it's a secondary unit and you can tell that from the street, then I think we're achieving that goal and still allowing some flexibility for those smaller units. And so maybe staff can take a look at some examples of housing, and then come back with a visual that shows a house 90%, house 80%, house 70%, and that would give us the ability to kind of look and say, this is kind of the goal, this is how we visualize that goal, and we're comfortable with that number, because I'm going to need to see what that looks like so that I know what a percentage actually means aesthetically for a neighborhood.
I would just say the only challenge with that is you could take a footprint of a house and it could change none, you know, it could change not at all. I mean, if you have a home and you convert a portion of that home, it's a multi-level home, to an ADU, on the outside it could look exactly the same. So it's hard to model up what that may
Chris,
look
you
like.
have thought?
Your request for providing some type of visuals is difficult because you can build a home, a long, narrow home, and then copy it, orient it the other direction. It looks half the size of that. So it's all about design. And so it really isn't about size, it's about design. So
What about just a little bit lower number, like 75 or 80, that gets you to a more, I mean, once you get a house that's like 1,500 square feet or bigger, this discussion becomes moot. So I'm just thinking about all the cottages that are out there, the 800 square foot bungalows, the 1,000 square foot houses, and not overly restricting the ability to throw mom and pop in there or whatever. So
Unsure as to if a percentage is necessary when you have 30% green space. You can't make it bigger than 800 square feet, and then you have the primary house. I don't think it's likely that you're going to have two 800 square feet houses, or 800 square feet house and 800 square feet ADU, 30% green space. That doesn't seem like a likely plot in Bellingham. I'm still not seeing why that part of the regulation is necessary.
Mike and then Lisa?
I think talking about not penalizing the small existing, like 800, 900,000 square foot homes, part of the appeal of this is if you had a really small home like that, and you have the capacity to build an ADU or do something like that, or you're selling to someone who does, the other option on the table is a tear down. And anyone who's considering this is considering maybe doing a tear down. And if that home is too small, you're in real danger of seeing a tear down. And being able to, if getting an ADU that's closer to 80, 90% of the size in the back means that doesn't happen, that's a huge win for the neighborhood, and that might be the difference maker. If you're limited to 400 square feet in the back, that doesn't pencil out. Sorry, 900 square foot house up front, got to go.
Yeah.
Like that could be the saving grace that prevents what we really don't want to see.
Well, that's what I'm talking about with like people by defaulting into a bigger home, and then you've got a bigger home that's more expensive for the next buyer because you're paying per square foot. And so just incentivizing people to tear down or build bigger just because so they can get more in the back when you could just give them more in the back. I agree completely.
Everyone's going to try and maximize the value they're allowed to do at any one given point. And so if you allow them to maximize the value through a detached ADU, it's better than all the alternatives.
I agree. Lisa?
I'd like to know more about the staff's thought on, you might not know historically why 40% was established, but you're moving it up 10%. Was there a thought process behind that, rather coming with, say, a 90% like Happy Valley?
That's based off of the model ordinance that the state provided back at that time in the mid-90s. And so that's what was used, and then the individual cities were able to modify that model ordinance to fit their locality. So I know that other cities have provided larger numbers. So if you look at the ADU, the ADU gauntlet in the attachment, other cities have gone to 70, 80, 90%. I think Mercer Island is at 90% and it's either 900 or 1,000 square feet. But no matter what, the smaller unit is a subordinate unit. It is the ADU. So if you have a 600 square foot home and you build an 800 square foot unit, the 800 square foot becomes the primary residence, the 600 square foot becomes the ADU. And if you look at these, the neighborhood north of you, where you say it's predominantly bungalow, one story, and you add one more that's equivalent of the size and scale, or 90% of the size and scale of what is predominantly in the area, it's fitting in to the size and scale. It's not overwhelming. So, that was part of the thought process. It's part of the history of that.
It's a good point, and Mike makes a good point. You made me think of an example. There was a house that was picked up and moved, an 800 square foot bungalow in my neighborhood that straddled two lots, and they picked it up and moved it onto one of the lots, and it was still an 800 square foot bungalow, and then the other lot was vacant, and they came in and built a really, really, really big single family home. And I know the people who live in the bungalow, and they're mad about it. They have no son. They have all these things, and if we give enough flexibility, an alternative to that might have been a smaller house with an ADU in the back, which frankly would look better and feel better. And I know the neighbors would be way happier about that than they would about this giant house that got built next to them because people maximized what they could. So I think there's some merit to that argument. And we're only talking about, if we cap it at 800, we're only talking about those really small houses. And again, if they're exactly the same size, but they're that small, who cares? Yeah, that's tiny. So, I'm almost, feel like you do in a sense. If it just says 800 or smaller, maybe, than existing, or...
Vancouver, BC does something interesting where it's a percentage of the whole lot. So that's like 0.16 of the whole lot. So 0.16 is picked out because on the 5,000, it says 12.5 here. I read 0.16 is 800 square feet on a 5,000 square foot lot. So whatever the numbers pencil out to be, you could do something like that. But I hate to introduce a number, the number of different math calculations you have to do to figure it out is like overlapping nightmare.
is there general support for going above 50 to something bigger?
Yes.
I mean, it sounds like everybody.
Increasing some-
Yeah, and
some
so
degree.
maybe, I think, Lisa, you suggested getting some thoughts from staff on what might be inappropriate. I think we all think 50 is too small. So maybe 100's too much, but we'd like to hear from staff where they think that number could sit that would be better. And obviously, the Happy Valley neighborhood thought 90 was okay. So I think we'd like to see some change in the ordinance when it's brought forward.
On the last thing in section 6, the removing the no more than 500 on a single floor, to accommodate disabled, I really love this provision. We shouldn't be mandating stairs in something that is intended for aging in place and other similar uses. People with mobility issues would really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, so now it is 9. We've still got 7 items. Obviously, this is complicated and requires, I mean, there's a lot of thought, which is good. You know, this is what we're here for, is to go through this point by point and talk about all these issues. So do we want to take a quick break and then come back to tackle these? Do we want to push through? You know, I do have a concern that we might not have time for public comment tonight, and that's just the way it is. And you're going to have an opportunity at the public hearing. And one thing I mentioned to Greg that I forgot to mention is, if we have a public hearing, and this happened with the waterfront, for example, if we have a public hearing and we take 3 hours of public comment and we don't get through everybody, we'll have another public hearing. We'll make sure that we hear from everybody who wants an opportunity to speak. And if that means 2 public hearings, then that's what we get to. But I'm hoping that members of the public who came to speak can see that we're taking this seriously and trying to really deliberate it, and we need that time. That's what we've been tasked with. So do you guys want to take a break or just keep pushing? Anybody need a potty break? Staff, you need a break? Chris, you've been standing for a while. If you pass out, Greg will grab you. Okay, yeah, let's just try and push through, and if we can, then maybe we'll have some time for people to participate.
Good. Okay, so, Mike, I think this next one gets to what you're saying, that Vancouver came up with a 0.16, basically some type of a ratio. We do have a ratio for the detached accessory dwelling unit and carriage unit, but we don't have it for attached accessory dwelling units. Not a lot of cities do this. This was created for the infill toolkit. We're finding that it is very challenging in existing single-family neighborhoods that aren't infill toolkit and such, and we're recommending that that be removed, again, as a means of, with the intent of consolidating, simplifying, and we have not been finding it useful.
Yeah, so our recommendation is to eliminate it.
I think it's good. I mean, I think you're seeing kind of evidence that it's not working well, and you're reacting to it. That's all we can ask for.
So, and at the last sentence there, we do say that we would keep it when it is being used in conjunction with infill toolkit housing, because that's what it was intended for. Okay.
How would that work, Chris? Would you have, when you present the ordinance, do you envision like a separate subsection that speaks to floor area ratio? Since you're taking those sections out of the infill toolkit, and they had their own floor, did they have their own floor area ratio in the infill toolkit, or was it whatever housing form they were using?
So how it currently works is, if you're going to build a detached accessory dwelling unit with a small lot, the floor area ratio is 0.4. But in the carriage unit section, it says that if you build a carriage unit, it can be increased to a 0.5.
Gotcha.
So that accommodates that additional mass and bulk.
So you
and
would-
so that would continue only for the infill toolkit.
That language just flip over to this new consolidated.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay?
So moving on to number 8, we proposing to retain the provision allowing no building setback when abutting an alley. This is for our detached accessory dwelling units. Sorry about that. Let's get caught up here. Proposing that the required 10-foot rear yard setback, when there is no alley, it would be reduced to 5 feet. Okay, so the rear yard, when there is an alley, there is no setback. When there isn't an alley, there's a 10-foot setback. We're proposing that that be reduced to 5 feet. So it would be the same as a side yard setback. Currently, when you build a detached accessory building, just an accessory building, there is no setback in the rear 32 feet of your property. You can build up to the property line. So if you were to incorporate a accessory dwelling unit, you would have to move it off the property line. And then we would include a provision that it could be reduced to no setback when it's approved as part of a subdivision, because when it's part of a subdivision, the developer is only impacting himself. He's not impacting adjacent property, occupied property, or private property. So when it's internal to a subdivision, it could be a zero lot line, and also when it's agreed upon between property owners. We need to work on that one a little bit about agreed upon between property owners, just to make sure the legality of all of that is in place.
Lisa?
Can I get some clarification for, I'm not necessarily opposed to reducing the setback, but I want a better understanding on what would be currently required if you have a street facing and you have a house here and a house here. What is the setback between those two houses currently in a single-family zone?
For the primary residence, it's a 5-foot side yard setback. In the rear 32 feet of the property, a detached accessory building can be built up to the property line. So off the alley, or if there is no alley, the back of the lot, the rear 32 feet, you can build to the property line. If that accessory building is going to extend forward of that 32 feet, it has to provide a jog in 5 feet.
So I'm trying to visualize, is it taking into account that you have two properties that are abutting each other, and if we decrease that setback and this person builds a detached ADU and this property builds one, is that setback on each part of the property line going to be compliant for being two, dwelling units?
Yes, because
makes sense.
they're on separate properties. So, if you build up to a property line, you have to provide a firewall separation. So it's added cost, but that's what the requirement is.
So if I build my detached ADU up to my property line, my neighbor wants to build theirs up to the property line, they'll be responsible as the second one being built to do the firewall if they don't.
Are you
provide
talking
a
Both
setback.
have to do it.
side property lines?
No, I'm talking about, because you're talking about the 5-foot setback for, isn't it the back of the property?
Yeah, the back of the
And this-
property.
So if there's 5-foot setback in the back of the property, and the adjacent property owner builds 2 years later an ADU, and they're using a 5-foot setback, is that combined 10-foot going to be compliant with various codes for fire and safety?
Yes.
Okay.
But if they go closer, then from 5 to 0 feet, you have a much more rigid firewall requirement, and also a really rigid, I think it's like 10% can be openings, so you can't have very many windows.
Is that to
either.
the property line if there's not an adjacent
Yeah,
dwelling?
it doesn't matter about what's next
Okay.
door, it's just the property line. So you actually, I'm thinking if you wanted to do this, you'd have more cost in the wall, and you'd have a really limited number of windows that you could have, right?
On that
On that line.
line.
It's almost like the building code helps us address some of the concerns by restricting that. Lisa makes a really good point about safety on the alley. I get it. We have alleys in my neighborhood, and my neighbor's house is actually in the corner of her property. So her house is on my property line and on the alley. They tucked her house literally in the corner, and she has big bollards her window is on the alley, and she has big bollards she had to put in the alley. They're technically in the alley to like protect her gas pipeline connection, and like probably because she doesn't want the garbage truck driving through her house. And I mean, what's the intent behind that reduction to 0? Is that just to give people more flexibility on their lot to create separation from the primary residence?
Yeah, if you have a 20-foot alley, and you have to provide a 10-foot setback, you're essentially losing 10 feet of your yard. So if you can move that to the property line, then you provide that much more open space and recreational space, as opposed to your driveway being paved in that 10 feet. Also, you know, with that current code, you have a 10-foot setback when you have a garage door, but your neighbor, if they don't have a garage door facing the alley, their building can go up to the property line. So suddenly, your visibility to the alley goes away, even though your building is set back. Your neighbor can build a 6-foot fence to the property line all the way to the alley. Your visibility goes away. So this 10-foot setback for the garage is totally defeated by all these other allowances.
Garrett.
That's been my observation of just driving through alleys, is seeing that there's already in most alleys some structure, and most of the structures are built right to the alley edge. So the setback for me on a detached structure near an alley isn't appropriate. I think especially when you're trying to preserve space between the primary use and the secondary use, and having usable spaces, that 10 feet that you preserve off the alley will be gravel, and it won't be serving any utility for the occupants.
Lisa?
I'm not necessarily opposed, but, you know, not everybody has a 20-foot alley. And so there are very narrow alleys in some of these neighborhoods, and 12 feet is not truly sufficient space for people to have their garbage behind their fence. And we're not talking about an auxiliary building where someone's storing their car in their shop. This is going to become places where people reside and sleep and families reside. And I think that if there is the ability that if we're going to utilize no setback on the alley, and that there's a trigger point that the alley is of a certain width, that we have to incorporate some type of prescribed safety measures like bollards, reinforcement, something, so that we don't have a situation that a garbage truck goes to, you know, it gets a flat tire, or someone's late to school and they're going 45 miles up that alley, and, you know, something happens, deer jump out and they avoid it, but now they've taken out a bedroom at 6 o'clock in the morning. So if we're going to go with no setback, I want some kind of safety requirement put in there as far as part of the design standard. I would say.
It's different if someone plows into your skis than if they plow into your bed, right? Yeah. What if we had a provision that, I'm just thinking out loud here, that was like if the alley's less than a certain width, you have to have a 2-foot setback with some sort of safety component, whether it's like like a CMU block wall or a bollards. I mean, bollards are not that complicated. Something that would give a little bit of gap so you could install something. I don't know.
And no.
I mean, from what I understand of traffic, like the wider the street, like the street visually
faster.
The street visually conveys how fast you should go, and so when we talk about road diets, Alabama, or whatever, like when you go to narrower lanes or like more things on your side, you feel like you should go slower. And so in an alley, a responsible citizen is driving slowly, and obviously there's bad actors, like you know that, but like every alley is different, and if you like when you're building that and you're worried that like a garbage truck is definitely gonna have trouble in this alley, you're gonna choose to step back. Like you don't want your property damaged, and like it feels like the building, like the person building it would want to put those bollards in themselves. Is there any, would an insurance company care about like the likelihood of something getting hit, like the setbacks at all? Is that priced into the insurance?
Yeah, I don't know. I tend to agree with just entertaining too many hypotheticals about what could or couldn't happen in an alley. Like, you know, they're not primary arterials. There's existing structures that are already, you know, at that setback. Is 2 feet appropriate? Is 3 feet? Is 5 feet? You know?
Fair enough.
And I would hope that someone would put a garage on the bottom, right on the alley. And so,
Yeah,
so
I think we
not
have to-
like a bedroom on the corner, but
Plus
that's,
that people have some judgment in that matter, and a lot of those structures, when you talk about carriage houses, the dwelling unit is above the garage. Not to say that that's what's gonna take place, but,
Well, if you have a garage in a 12-foot alley, the house would have to be set back 8 feet.
Right.
So you'd
well, you
be
could,
back.
if you had room to angle it
Yeah.
so that the driveway could be on the
what
side.
I think you could see probably most likely is that the space that is the required setback, if there was a required setback, is underutilized. It doesn't serve, it, you know, it may encourage people to park there and be sticking out into the alley. I think those are just right-of-ways that we could better utilize and have no setback and get more utility out of the structures.
Chris?
I just, you know, it kind of concerns me. If you have a 12-foot alley, cars coming head-on, one has to pull load out to let the other one pass. Once you get to the alleys in the Roosevelt neighborhood and even downtown and South Hill that are platted at 20 feet wide, that's enough room for 2 cars to pass. You're increasing speeds. It's feeling more open. And so it's almost like the wider the alley gets, potentially the more dangerous it becomes instead of the narrower. And so the safeguards, how to establish a threshold of when to put in safeguards becomes difficult.
Yeah.
So, you know, we'll explore it and see if we can come up with something. But that's a challenging one.
Love to show you 2 examples of 2 unpermitted ADUs that are right on the alley, and I know one of them has a bedroom that's right up against the alley, and I think renters, you know, they're assuming where they reside is safe, and I know the speeds that go through that alley. So, I mean, I do know real live examples where that's why I'm bringing it up. It is a concern.
Yeah.
Because it's not hypothetical over in my part of the neighborhood.
No, and it's not. I've gone on ADU tours up in Vancouver. They've gone to, you know, programs, and they have taken us on tours, and you see the ADUs that are built right up to the alley. And once you start seeing not just garages, but living space on the alley, and that it's a human zone, not just an auto zone, it is now becoming a human zone. Mentally, for people driving, it's one more cue to slow down. So, but yeah, I have seen many built right to the alley because I've been going on the tours.
In Vancouver, they call them laneway houses because the laneway is the term for an alley, and they're
Exactly.
built right on the laneway.
Yeah. Okay. Next one, number 9, aesthetic design. So, current standards for both attached and detached require design compatibility standards relative to the primary house, such as building materials and so on and so forth. Currently, for detached ADUs, we require that it does not have a street facing. It cannot be on the same facade as the main entrance to the home. Actually, sorry about that. This is for attached accessory dwelling units. So for attached accessory dwelling units, our current code says that the ADU main entrance can't be on the same facade as the primary residence's main entrance. And we would like to change that so they can be on the same facade, but that the ADU entrance has to be visually subordinate through design, through placement, stepped back, combination thereof. And there's many reasons for this. The original intent is, for only one, is to make sure that the home has the appearance of a single-family home. But when you come to emergency services that need to respond, they need to find where the main entrance to that ADU is because it's not through the primary residence. When you have service deliveries, when you have visitors, if your neighbor across the street sees strangers walking around the side of your house, it creates angst. There's many reasons why it's beneficial to have that main entry on the front. And again, that can be dealt with design so that it appears subordinate.
You're proposing that to allow that but not require that.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that's good.
Anybody else have thought on that particular? I had written down a question at the first meeting on this saying, how? How do you plan to implement the compatibility standards? Would those be explicit in the ordinance, kind of like they are in like the infill toolkit, where there's design standards in a sense, like mini design standards that are administratively applied?
Yes, there will be design standards. We're not going to tell you how to do it. Basically, the instruction is that you will make it visually subordinate.
They'll be broad. I mean
Broad,
more.
yes.
I just mean more the general standards like design compatibility, building details, massing, proportion of materials. Those will be like general standards. Then it's up to the applicant to show you how they did that.
Right, right.
Yeah. The idea being you don't have like a stucco ADU with a lap-sided house out front, something like that.
Right.
I think that's important. That, you know, for character and all those things.
Okay, anything else? Okay, number 10 is bedrooms. Allow a maximum of 2 bedrooms in an accessory dwelling unit. Currently, there is no bedroom limit for detached accessory dwelling units, but there is a 2-bedroom limit for attached accessory dwelling units. Again, we're trying to consolidate, and the 2-bedroom limit seems appropriate.
Looks like we all agree. Yeah.
Good. Occupancy. This is where another discrepancy occurs. Total number of persons who may occupy a detached accessory dwelling unit shall not exceed 3, regardless of relationship. And actually, I have that backwards. It is attached accessory dwelling units have a limit of 3 people. Detached accessory dwelling units do not have a limit. And so we're looking to consolidate that to 3 people that would be allowed in any accessory dwelling unit.
Mike?
I think we talked about this last time. A couple that has a child, like,
Can't have another kid.
oops. Like, it seems like with a limit of 2 bedrooms, you effectively nearly accomplish that. Or, you know, there's sort of a theoretical maximum of 4.
I'm pretty sure
with
the
2
building
bedrooms.
code prohibits more than 2 people from occupying a bedroom, right? Is that a building code thing? If I feel like in my head something's telling me that you can't have more than 2 people in a bedroom, but maybe that's just practical.
In practical terms, you're either going to have 2 couples, or you might have 2 kids, you know, share a
Yeah, Iris. Yeah.
And doesn't the rental registration also,
Oh, maybe that's where it's
rental
going.
registration has
That
a
where I'm
limit
getting in
of
my head?
occupancy
Yeah.
limit. This to me seemed very low, especially compared to the other examples that were given. Seemed very low and restrictive.
I feel like 2 people a bedroom is a pretty reasonable.
I like the 2-bedroom limit. I mean,
Yeah.
part of this is like an alternative to a boarding house. Like, you're going to have 2 smaller units, and they're going to be limited bedrooms. They're not going to be stuffing people in there for like maximizing that rental value. So 2 bedrooms is good. That seems like a natural limit. And like, we have a hard time enforcing a number of people like rule. Like, we're just not good at that. But if we can enforce a bedroom count rule at the construction end, then we don't have to go around enforcing. Like, how do you enforce there's only 3 people living there? It seems very difficult to do.
Lisa?
I could see 4 in the sense that you have parents and 2 children. You have 2 couples sharing a dwelling unit, although 800 square feet is very small
Yeah.
for multiple adults, but I could see 2 per bedroom. But I'm wondering, I believe there is the rule of 3 on the city books, that no more than 3 unrelated people are allowed within a dwelling. And I'm wondering if getting rid of, where it says regardless of relationship, because I think at some point the city will have to address the rule of 3 because it's just not followed. Whether you support it or you don't support it, but it's something that's not enforced, and it is a point of angst amongst many people, and it comes forward often in argument. But I kind of think that if we're putting something in that contradicts that, that is not necessarily the best of planning. So I think the rule of 3 is unrelated people. Is it possible we can put that in as far as what that ordinance is, and so that we're not addressing family situation? And then in the future, when the city makes a change or doesn't, but if they do, kind of like with the comp plan, it becomes sweeping and it goes through every place where it's been referenced.
I agree, Lisa, but isn't that a reason not to reference it in this code? Because if the Bellingham ordinance says no more than 3 unrelated, it doesn't matter we don't need to say anything here, just no more than 3 unrelated. And if we change that to 2 or 4 or 5 or whatever, it would change uniformly throughout the code.
Or
I
you
do-
can, I think it's important to have an occupancy aspect.
I think having
but-
4, I would say just say 4.
But then
period.
that contradicts what the city has on the books on a different ordinance.
Well, not
correct?
say regardless of relationship, just say the total number of persons who may occupy the detached accessory dwelling should not exceed 4. That protects the family that Mike's talking about, but that doesn't trump the no more than 3 unrelated rule.
I think it does, doesn't it?
I don't think it would, right? It wouldn't.
I think it would take a policy interpretation. If you just say, shall not exceed 4 people,
It could present, okay.
it could create a
All right,
conflict.
no, well,
But
okay.
your notion there that this would be a regulation that would apply to ADUs, and when the city updates its definition of family, if that changes, but the current definition is maintained just for ADUs because ADUs only have 2 bedrooms, and that would help out the family situation. We can explore that. I think that's worth exploring.
Chris, what section of code does the rule of 3 live
The definitions.
in definitions?
The zoning code definition.
Yeah, and see, I think that's where those sorts of things are appropriate. I think our development regulations and our ordinances that are regarding just structures should just stick to the structures, what you could actually enforce and control. You can permit or not permit based on number of bedrooms. So if it's 2 bedrooms max, I don't think there should be any stipulation of occupants in this ordinance.
Because 4 kids who are unrelated living together would be breaking the rules.
This is not enforceable. It's just so, what, we should put things that we actually can enforce. And when somebody comes in for a permit application, we can enforce how many bedrooms and bathrooms, size, bulk, scale, mass. That's appropriate. That belongs to a different portion of the code, and let it be there. I think we should strike it.
Many other cities do have a definition provision for their ADU. The reason for ours is an accessory dwelling unit is an accessory component to the primary residence. We treat the whole thing as a single-family home. If we only leave the property
I see.
to the family definition, that's why that was originally adopted for the ADUs.
Because it's treated as a completely subordinate use, so then it basically becomes additional bedrooms to the primary residence. is what
Yes.
it does.
So if 2 friends lived in a house and then they wanted to rent an ADU to 2 friends, that would technically be breaking, you'd be looking at it as 1 unit, and that would be 4 unrelated people living in 1 unit,
Conceivably.
conceivably.
So, I mean, could we have a definition section that just says that it should, the occupancy shall be treated as a residence? Fall under the purview of the
Like the ADU would be its own dwelling unit?
As far as occupancy goes.
Keep that in the definitions chapter instead
Yeah.
of in the ADU
Yeah,
ordinance.
yeah,
That, we could look at that also.
seems to make sense.
Can I clarify, because my brain was trying to imagine this? So, and please tell me I'm wrong, but, so an attached accessory dwelling unit, say there's 3 bedrooms as a primary residence and 2 bedrooms as the attached ADU. Are they, as far as by definition in the codes, are they treated as it's a combined residence, but they're also separate by that rule that you could have 3 unrelated people in the smaller unit and you could have like a family of 5 in the primary resident, and that is not going to contradict as far as the rule of 3?
Correct.
Oh, I was thinking of it wrong.
Because
Thank
that's
you.
what I
Yeah,
was thinking
thank
you were saying, but I wasn't understanding that. So I was thinking there wasn't that limit in the sense that all of a sudden you couldn't rent it out because you had 3 unrelated people
Yeah, that makes
and a
me feel better.
primary resident already, so then making that other area uninhabitable. So,
I think our code says that there are different dwelling units and the rule of 3 applies separately to the different dwelling units. In Seattle, it's considered for the whole lot, but their number is like 8.
It's like 8.
And they're talking about going to 12 because they're allowing attached and detached, like one of each.
Yeah.
And so if you look through the list here, the max occupancy is like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Like the numbers are a lot higher, and that may be because of the difference of dwelling versus lot.
I think Garrett and Lisa are right on both comments that we're going to confront the definition at some point in the future, and that should be confronted in the definition section, and then that change would impact everything, right? Right, Greg?
Yeah, and I think that we're going to be confronting that sooner rather than later. The meetings that the City Council Planning Committee has been having on housing choice and affordability, that's one of the issues that they've discussed. And I think, if I look into my crystal ball, I think they're going to have us look at that family definition sooner rather than later.
In light of that, I support Garrett's position that we should regulate in here what we know we can, because we know enforcement's a concern anyway, so why throw more stuff in there that we can't follow through on?
Right.
You know, Lisa?
is there an opinion from either of you, the value of retaining this versus just deleting it with, based on the conversation we've had? I mean, can you see a reason why you would feel it should still remain?
I'd say that we should retain something consistent with what's in place so that we maintain consistency and that when that topic is broached for the citywide, it will be addressed at that time.
So would there be value to keep this there, but then just use some of the wording from what's currently on the city books so that we're not contradicting if we increased to 4?
Yes.
Making the statement on unrelated
Like
versus,
you could say the total number of persons who occupy the detached ADU shall be consistent with the definition of a dwelling unit. And then if that definition changes, it stays consistent with that. Something like that. Is that kind of what you're thinking? Like a reference to it?
That makes sense.
I don't know if that's the exact language, but something along those lines.
and if you need to put it in writing for ease of someone going through, because I know when we went through the comp, we really try to streamline, so you're not referencing another section to reference another section.
Right.
So if the content needs to be put in there for ease of having, not having to go to other pages to find the information, I think that would be probably prudent, because I think that was one of the goals we strived with the comp plan.
So just so I'm clear, the preliminary direction is to not have a occupancy limit in this section of the code, just to refer to the definition section?
Yes.
Is that, yeah.
That-
Or incorporate that definition language is what Lisa said.
If you think that that is the best route, but if you also think for ease of someone reading this and having all the information contained in one location without having to reference a second location, then take the verbiage from the other section and insert it here.
Okay.
Iris?
I think my thought with this was that DADUs on a single-family lot do provide a really unique opportunity, say, for a communal living experience. If a group was to purchase a home, build a DADU to expand that ability. And so I hope that the rule of 3 is something that will be looked at soon, and I would be disappointed if we moved forward with this and missed the opportunity to create some more flexibility and then down the line that wasn't looked at.
So we could include in the findings the reason why you're doing it this way, but that you
Excellent.
believe the family definition or the dwelling unit definition should be reviewed sooner rather than later. We could put that in the findings.
I think there's a separate issue here than the unrelated number. Is that like the ADU is intended to have a smaller count than
Yeah.
like a primary residence can have 12 related folks living in it. Like there's no limit, but the ADU should have an overall lower number. We don't but I think we're feeling we don't need to specify a specific number. Just the fact that it's 2 bedrooms inherently means it's
Yeah, you're
going to
not
be
going to put 12 people in a 2-bedroom ADU.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't?
Before we go on to parking, I think we need to take a moment at this time to discuss owner occupancy, because I know Iris has thoughts on that you probably want to share, and I think other people do too. And it'll give us an opportunity to talk about an issue that I want to talk about, which is the concept of a rezone versus what we're doing. And so, I don't know, let's talk about, because we're talking about occupancy. I didn't see anything in here that talked about an owner occupancy restriction. It kind of worried me. Is that just
Only changes.
is that just because it's already required? So I don't know.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I was gonna wait until the end of the meeting. 'Cause-
I think the owner occupancy topic is the appropriate point to talk about it.
Well, yeah, that, I mean, I stand by the owner occupancy rule. I think it's real important when we're talking about, I think that's the defining feature between this being a development regulation and being a rezone. And I think when this goes to council, you guys you're gonna hear that. You're gonna hear testimony and they're gonna say, this is a rezone. Effectively, this is what this is. I don't agree with that. I think this is a development regulation. I think this is a housing form that is currently allowed as an attached ADU within a single family. I think this is an expansion of a development regulation that governs single-family uses. That's why I think the owner occupancy requirement is so important, because that's the defining difference between multifamily and, having a rental and having a single-family neighborhood. So I know that you guys are prepared, but in your testimony and your presentation to council, that's going to come up, and I hope that we could be defensible in that. And what do you say when I say, Greg, this is a rezone? What do you say?
We say that we are revising the accessory uses that are allowed on a single-family lot. A rezone would be increasing the allowed density or allowing triplexes or changing the minimum lot size for a single-family house. These are accessory uses, accessory to single-family.
Which are already allowed.
Which are
as
already
an attached
allowed, yeah.
use in
Right.
every single residential single neighborhood.
And you saw on the map where all the areas where detached are already allowed
Right.
in single-family zones.
Right.
But could it be considered a rezone in those single-family neighborhoods where detached is not necessarily allowed?
Ow.
And would be? I'm just asking, because that is going to be a question that comes
Yeah, no,
up.
we don't, as I said, these are accessory to single-family, and the owner has to live on site. So, no, it's not we don't consider it a rezone.
I think it's a false narrative, and it's scary because it's perpetuating in the comment we're seeing, and it's not true. And it was presented in an oral testimony to us at the last meeting, and it's not true. And I think we have to go on the record early. I don't think we should wait for council to talk about this, because we received comment in the written comment from people who clearly were uninformed about what a rezone is. We received comment from people who said, I heard from somebody that you're rezoning all the single-family neighborhoods to multifamily, and that's like a scare tactic, and that's like it's a false narrative, and it's going to misinform people about what this is about. And I wholeheartedly support Garrett's comments because I was really disappointed to see that narrative put out there by people who I think know better than that. And these are already allowed as attached. So saying you can have an ADU and now we're making it detached, that's not rezoning to a multifamily use. That's still a single. Greg, you said it perfectly. It's just changing where the accessory use that's already permitted sits on the lot. And so I just think, maybe I'm passionate about this, but I just feel like it's not fair and it's misinforming the public, and we're already seeing commentary on that. And I know Garrett and I have spoken because he received an individual who confronted him face-to-face about it who was misinformed about that. And I just think it's really important. And so I would recommend, this is just my personal opinion, but I would recommend that when that comes up at our public hearing, at the council level, that we need to be really clear about what we're doing. I don't think it's fair to the dialogue that we're having. And it takes us away from what we're really talking about.
The gentleman that Ali referenced, when we had the discussion about whether it's a rezone or whether it's an expansion of already approved accessory uses, when I told him that the owner-occupied provision was going to be maintained in force, that alleviated significant concern. And I think that's appropriate, and I think that's an appropriate concern. But, because people don't always read the draft, documents, or they don't know the full details of the existing ordinance, there's misconception, and
Yeah.
and the narrative gets out there that something's happening with single-family neighborhoods, and so I think it is, when we have our public hearing and we're going to take testimony, we're going to hear a lot of that, and I certainly would appreciate it if, our planning professionals are defensible in that position, because you're in the right. This is a correct application of land use regulations.
I would like, and I agree, but I'd like to address the tone. I don't think necessarily defensible, but I think it's a good educational opportunity. I'm not a professional. I don't work in the profession. I don't have 20 years behind me. I've been a couch planning, junkie for 15 years, and involved in my neighborhood with neighborhood plan updates. And, I've got a litany of, I got pages of terminology that when I first started, you guys were like winging words back and forth and acronyms, and I'm writing everything down and going back and looking up, making sure that I understood what it was. And, my first couple of months, half the time I wasn't aware what something was. So I've been educating myself, and I don't think necessarily the public is, I think people passionately believe that this is a rezone, and that they think of multifamily because you're looking at a single-family lot that may, not new development, but current, residence where you have one house, and now you're putting two houses. And so to them, that seems like it's multifamily because you have multifamilies living on a single-family lot. And that's the brain process of understanding the terminology and how it applies to what they see happening. So, it would be useful, and it'd be useful for me to understand the standards and practices and the rules and the law in the sense of how terminology is applied and how it's governed through making these changes. So when people see things, they know that you're changing. And then there's concern of the effect. And I do believe that owner occupancy is the linchpin on whether or not any of this goes forward successfully and more palatable to a lot of people who have a lot of concerns.
Sure.
But I think when it comes time, use it as an educational opportunity as part of the introduction to help define the difference between what it is you're trying to accomplish and what an actual rezone is. Because I hear from people that you guys haven't gone through the proper process, because when you look at a rezone, first you have all the neighborhood meetings, you have information that goes out from the city to notify the residents of a change. They have the opportunity to meet before this information comes before us. And that process wasn't done, and so people feel like the process for a rezone hasn't been followed. And I don't think they're trying to use it as a way to spread misinformation. It's what they understand because they're not professionals and have all these years of experience. So I think it's going to be I would appreciate that information and a clearer definition and how this applies to it and why it is not a rezone, but not necessarily in your technical language, because I don't want to go get a master's degree in planning, but something that a layperson is going to be able to understand and apply it. I think that would be useful.
Thanks, Lisa. I agree. I think having an explanation would be really helpful. Appreciate those comments. I don't know if I agree completely, though. I think a lot of the people that are making those comments know a lot about what we're doing, and they're people who participate actively and are aware of what we're doing. And I think when you tell people it's a rezone, I'm worried about the people that you're talking about who don't know, the lay people. And when they're told by people they trust that something is something, they believe it without looking into it. And, I'm not going to, I guess I shouldn't try and assume what people are trying to accomplish, but I just think that is not a narrative that needs to be out there. And people should, maybe it's just as simple as explaining to people that you can have an attached ADU now. So we're not talking about adding a house to a lot that has one house. You can already do that. They just happen to be attached, and now they're detached. And there's a big difference.
Well,
but I think that the owner occupancy is a linchpin, because if you take that away, then you are creating two
Right.
units on a lot. That's the difference. If you don't have an owner occupancy, it's an apartment. It's just a 2-unit detached apartment.
If you look at some of the written comments, the people are
Duplex,
questioning.
thank you, yeah.
People are questioning, why we're removing the owner occupancy requirement. So there's all kinds of misinformation
yeah.
floating around out there.
And that's a
anything
key
we can
issue.
do to clear that up, we're happy to do.
Anything? I know you have thoughts on owner occupancy.
Yeah.
I'm very curious.
I'm not sold on it, but I think there's some things that we should consider. More than half of Bellingham homes are renters. Renters deserve to live in single-family neighborhoods also. We have a serious shortage of housing, and a competition for low and middle rent places. A lot of neighborhoods are seem to be kind of have that conversion, especially on the edge of like the Leonard Streets neighborhood. I live in a duplex that was a single family house that was turned into a duplex, and there's at least 4 of them on our block. And it creates a home for 2 couples in one single family home. It's a really efficient use of space. We're able to share the yard costs and share taking care of our space. And I think our street looks just like any other Leonard Streets neighborhood. And we're able to do so at a cost that's affordable. So I understand that it's a linchpin. I also think that the polarizing voices that are so against removing the owner occupancy are not necessarily a majority. And if we broaden the conversation and educated people about what we mean by owner occupancy, I do think it would be less polarizing. That being said, I was looking at an interesting survey of Seattle residents, and it certainly is polarizing. 1/3 of people were strongly in favor of removing owner occupancy, and 2/3 were strongly against it. And it was like kind of the one issue where there was literally no one that didn't feel strongly about it. And so, while I'm certainly not, I'm not in favor of removing it, I don't think that it's as polarizing as we think, and I think that it's something that we shouldn't say we're removing or that we're keeping owner occupancy, and the next time we look at this, we should certainly keep it again, because places like Vancouver have gotten rid of owner occupancy requirements, and it was one of the regulations that they cite as being one that was very arduous and one of the reasons that there's been such an increase in DADU building.
And then that's a good comment, and it begs the question of like if we went there, would this become a rezone and go through an entirely different legislative process?
No, I don't think so, but we would have the concern about developers buying up places. I think that's the major concern.
That's the flip side.
We have, that's a interesting discussion. I'm I'm not fearful of most development patterns. I think people generally, with the right guidance, try to do well. The owner occupancy is really important to me. To me, that's the difference between, more of a rezone and what a development regulation is. Because, we have mandates in our growth management that require us to preserve single-family neighborhoods. And now the housing options and forms can change within those neighborhoods, but that is an important part of the fabric of our community. So, but I wouldn't be opposed to, if we had a threshold limit of, say, 1%, 2%, that gets looked at, because things change. And whereas that is really important right now, to me at least, in 15, 20 years, as other needs have higher, priorities, that might not be. So it might be something that we think about revisiting. If we do put a threshold into the draft ordinance, that is something that's targeted to look at.
So, ADUs is a term that kind of is pretty new in planning speak. Washington, that first came around in the early 90s, 93, when the state, because of housing prices and pressure, kind of mandated all communities to look at that, and some went with the draft language, and others went more aggressive. A lot of other cities started with detached and single-family neighborhoods from the get-go, and those cities are now looking at removing owner occupancy. We started more conservatively and are now taking this step. So I think what Garrett's saying maybe is interesting. The area where, so there's all these pre-existing non-conforming use outbuilding dwellings. So they're not necessarily ADUs. They existed way before we called them ADUs. A lot of them have not been brought into compliance. And that's one of the big issues, one of the big criticisms, and a lot of the feedback we hear is, why aren't we counting the non-conforming pre-existing ones? And I imagine one of the big barriers to bringing them into compliance is they're probably not owner-occupied. And so a lot of the hating on ADUs we get in our comments is not about the newly constructed ones. I mean, staff said last time, the newly constructed permanent ones do not have compliance complaints or in general issues. The police survey you mentioned, it's those pre-existing, predating the 90s. And it doesn't sound like there's been a lot of construction of unpermitted ADUs since the 90s either. So if one of our goals, if you clamped down immediately and removed all those outbuildings from the housing stock, the pre-existing unpermitted illegal ADUs from the housing stock, you'd have 500 people out on the streets, and that would have a huge ripple effect through the rental market. You would create instant homelessness. Some of those people would not be able to find homes. And no one's calling for that. But if there's some sort of way to do a rolling program to bring those into compliance, that's in everyone's best interest. But they're not going to come into compliance if they're not owner-occupied. And so there's kind of a tension there that is unresolvable with the way the rules are now, and we're going to continue with.
One solution that, Garrett, you brought up, I think, years ago when we first started was maybe a baby step would be looking at the multifamily zones. I think the area you live in is actually zoned multifamily, and so we see that a lot where you have a house in a single-family neighborhood that's got multifamily zoning and it's turned into a duplex. I mean, I think you brought this up years ago, the idea of why do we have an owner occupancy restriction in a multifamily neighborhood when you could build a duplex and have two families living next to each other, but if you want to build an ADU behind your house, one of them has to be owner occupied. That doesn't make sense. I don't think that makes sense. So maybe something to consider is as a step in that direction would be looking at removing that requirement in a multifamily zone only.
Yeah, one thing is when you're talking about densities, because there are single-family homes and multifamily neighborhoods that don't have the required density to do a duplex.
Yeah.
Say if you have a 5,000 square foot lot and you need 3,500 per unit, so you need 7,000 to do a duplex, but you only have 5,000 square feet. That's where that begs the question. Is it appropriate to allow more density? Or is that's not a accessory use, that's intensifying the density. So that is a zoning, concern there. So, but should owner occupied requirements in multifamily zone? Probably not. It's probably not appropriate. That's not, the idea behind our land zoning designations is to get the highest and best use out of those zoned areas. And that is prohibitive. I mean, clearly, if there's density in a multifamily, you should be able to have an ADU. That would disincentivize people to do a tear down and build a duplex, right? That would give you options. And
Yeah.
that certainly, if that's not part of this code, that certainly should be a qualifier if you have the density.
Lisa?
Gentlemen, help me out with this. I'm having such a deja vu of this conversation and agreeing with you that in a multifamily, owner occupancy is not as critical. And we talked about ADUs. Did we address this in the comp plan?
I think we talked about it. I think that's when Garrett brought it up.
But it
was
didn't,
never
because we had a
addressed.
conversation on this, and I remember talking about that and agreeing that, you know, it is a multifamily because your example of tearing down an old house that could be basically turned into a duplex, keep the old house because that's really more efficient and environmental, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, because a duplex wouldn't have to be owner occupant.
Right.
So why would a ADU situation in a multi-family have to be owner occupied? That doesn't make any sense to me either.
It's a good point. Let us check the exact language in the comp plan. I think what it says, policy statements, if I remember right, is to require owner occupancy in single-family zones.
Yeah.
I think is what the policy
Yeah,
says.
can you look, we can circle back to this issue.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot of good discussion on it.
We should allow that. I mean, that's a perfect opportunity as we're rewriting this ordinance to take those multifamily zoned areas and allow that flexibility. I can see that. That's not just a hypothetical. The preservation of housing stock. You're going to be able to get a higher unit yield on a multifamily property, and you don't have to do a demolition of an existing structure. And there may be value to that existing structure. So that.
And you don't have to confront the issue Lisa raises, which is scary for people, which is, you know, I've got one house with a guest house, and now I've got two houses by different people, the
Right.
single-family component. It gives us a slow lead into that. Lisa?
And I'm just going to go on a limb and go wild here and probably shock you guys with this, but in a multifamily, providing you're maintaining that 30% green space, what's to prevent a situation of rehabbing an old house into two dwelling units and building a detached ADU and not having owner occupancy as a requirement?
If it had the
Only-
density, right?
Pardon?
If it had the density for 2 units.
Correct.
Yeah.
Or possibly
Now we're talking.
3, because you
Okay.
have, you have a large house, upstairs, downstairs, you've converted it into like a 2-apartment dwelling, but then you build the detached ADU, providing you're meeting the other criteria for green space and everything else, because again, if we're not tearing down that old house, I mean, I know somebody who recently converted old house from a duplex back into an old house for their family. So, but they were thankful that this beautiful old house was still available, and they were able to do that conversion. And I'd rather see the preservation of these old houses, but also the opportunity to create more housing stock and density in a multifamily area.
Good point.
And I think all the comments we've received to date would probably be compatible with that
Yeah,
idea.
Yeah.
I think so.
The question is density, so Chris, you guys can look at that, because the infill toolkit allowed for, these different housing forms in multifamily. It still had the owner occupancy provision, which it, probably shouldn't, but it still required density, right? It still
No,
required
the,
density.
in the infill toolkit, you don't have to,
don't
it
have
doesn't
to-
count as a density.
yeah.
It's what Lisa said.
Yeah.
If you have a density for 2 units in the infill toolkit in a multifamily, you can build a duplex and you can have an ADU, but you have an owner occupancy requirement.
Right.
So it's something to talk about more.
You do one or the other. You can't build a duplex and then on that duplex property that
Right.
You can't build a duplex and add an ADU to that. What you could do is you could build a duplex on a 6,000 square foot lot, or you could build a single family home with an ADU.
Oh, okay.
You can't, an ADU can only occur in conjunction with
Get the
a
density.
single family home.
cottage, those kind of ones, the small house, smaller house.
Yes.
Gotcha. Well, interesting. That's an interesting point. So let's talk parking real quick, and then we can maybe wrap up.
9 minutes. Go.
We still have Happy Valley proposals to go through.
Well,
So
I
there's
don't, do
there's
we?
5 there.
I
That's
mean,
attachment 2A.
Because we're not proposing that.
We're not proposing.
I don't think we're proposing that we do Happy Valley.
No, well, it would be an amendment, it would be code amendments that you would be providing recommendations on as a pilot program to move forward and planning to the city council.
I guess, Chris, what all he's saying is we're past that. If we're recommending that this gets implemented citywide, this is incorporating detached ADUs in single-family zones, which is the kind of bulk of the Happy Valley pilot program. That's the main difference.
I do see the value of addressing it separately because they've put a lot of effort into it. And if it's not supported at the city council level to allow detached ADUs in single-family neighborhood, there goes Happy Valley's project. And so if we do keep it separate,
Or at least
it
there,
is.
there goes our commentary on it.
Well, right, but I mean, I'm just thinking that I think there's value in keeping separate consideration, because there's not a guarantee one would be approved, but maybe there's more likely the other would. And so I would just hate to miss that opportunity after all the work that they've put forward.
It's a good point.
Yeah, I would agree. They did put a lot of work into it, and maybe after you go through it, at the end, you decide, well, we should just use the citywide rules anyway, but at least we should spend the time to go through
Fair
it. And
enough.
what I would suggest is that we not do that when we've been at this for 3 hours. At the next, let's see, we don't have any items 11.2, but 11.16, we're going to start talking about the commercial code revisions. We could take the first half an hour of that meeting, hammer out these last few items,
Lisa, you're
and still go
correct.
ahead with the public hearing on the 7th.
I agree, actually, now hearing your thought process. We would be abdicating our participation if the citywide proposal failed. You make a very good point. But I think Greg makes another good point. Well, no, it's 10, and we should just do this at the next meeting if we have another meeting before our public hearing. I don't think it will take us, that commercial code won't take a 3-hour meeting maybe, and we could give some time to,
And everything in the Happy Valley is stuff there's stuff
Not
we've
that
talked
different.
about. There's just different parameters,
Yeah.
different numbers.
Can we finish up though with the parking and utilities so we feel like we're done with the other one? Is that okay? I don't think that'll
Sure.
take very long.
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
Iris, thought?
Yes, I am opposed to requiring an on-site parking stall. A few reasons. More than a majority of Seattle respondents said that requiring parking was a significant barrier to building an ADU. ADUs are a different style of housing, and therefore the idea, I believe, would be that they'd attract a potentially different style of person, different needs. Also, since a majority of the ADUs will be rented, I think that's something that can be taken up with a renter. If this primary house has 3 parking spots, maybe the part of the rental agreement would be that the renter would get 1, or they would get none, and they would, and that would be a choice that the renter would be then making.
So the current requirement is for 1 parking space for attached ADUs. We're proposing that same requirement be required for detached ADUs. We also were proposing an option where the planning director could reduce that requirement based on certain site conditions.
I thought that.
Yeah, if I can correct, our attached accessory dwelling unit ordinance requires 1 per bedroom.
1 per bedroom, I'm sorry.
Detached ADU requires 1 regardless of the number of bedrooms. And we would be recommending that only 1 stall be required for all ADUs. And then we would include a provision that would allow the planning director, first one, that if, in order to provide an on-site parking stall, you had to put in a curb cut that took away street parking, then you do not have to put in that curb cut. The street parking is more valuable as public parking than private parking is. Second, that the planning director would have the discretion to reduce the parking on site based on site-specific factors, that it'd be the responsibility of the applicant to demonstrate what those are that deserve the reduced parking.
Yeah, I think that was a concern that I had, is that we need flexibility, and we need to be able to see that, we can't predict what every one of these is going to look like. So there may be ample parking within the primary residence, and they could come up with a park sharing agreement. It may be an area that's on a bus route, on a high, on a go route that's got a lot of transit, and they may be able to demonstrate that the lower parking threshold is appropriate. So I think it'd be nice to have some guidance, and to what, would we have some criteria that the applicant would be able to show? The burden of proof would be on them to be able to make their case to the planning director. Would we give them some guidance, like as far as public transit or bike parking?
Yeah, no, there's public transit, bike parking, availability of street parking. Some
Yeah.
streets only have parking on one side, other streets have parking on both sides of the street. Some streets have no parking available. And so, there's every property is going to have a different scenario, and we'd be looking at it on a case-by-case basis.
But we would do that administratively. We would establish those criteria administratively, because we may not think of every circumstance to put in the code, right? So we would.
Yeah. If you have a house, a single family requires 2 stalls. So if you had a single family home with 3 stalls, would this require you to add another stall, or could you steal one from the single family home and apply it to the ADU?
Yeah, the third stall is excess. It's more than what's required.
So if you had 3 stalls on the site, you could design your site and say, well, that third stall is my required stall?
Yes.
Okay.
Personally, I'm comfortable with this. I hate the idea of reducing parking, but I do think we are developing towards having a better transportation and infrastructure with bike. We're not there yet, so I'm not entirely comfortable getting rid of a parking requirement, but I think a reduction from 1 per bedroom down would be appropriate. And I think it's one of those things, as we go into the future, maybe that would be one of the things that has changed down the line. But again, people haven't gotten rid of their cars. I mean,
Yeah.
come to my area and you'll find out. But I do like the idea that if on site they can demonstrate that it's not going to have a huge impact by a further reduction, and there's an internal mechanism to, make that decision. I think that allows that flexibility that hopefully would reduce some of the barriers.
Mike, did you have a comment?
Do parking spots count as the open space requirement?
No. Open space is pervious.
Unless they're pervious.
Parking is generally impervious, yes.
My only concern, Iris, I appreciate where you're coming from with Seattle. My only concern is that we're not Seattle yet. That's kind of where I'm at with Lisa a little bit, is like we don't have grocery stores easily accessible to people. We don't have the resources for people to walk to their needs as much as, say, Seattle, where like these neighborhoods are much more compact and have a longer history of dense development. So I like the idea of getting there eventually. I'm always telling people in my neighborhood meetings for my projects, we're building for the future. We're not building for your current parking issues, and people always get mad about that, but I'm totally on that train of like, we need to plan for what we're going to look like 30, 40, 50 years from now. I just don't know if we're there yet to go completely.
I hope we get there.
I do too.
But, it is that we're in that middle step currently, I think. We're not there yet, but I think the city's making great strides with their transportation plan to assist us to get there.
I agree with
And
that.
we do have food deserts, we do have, people don't have a go line, and, we are in the Northwest, we don't melt, but we do get wet. And when you have to walk, 10 blocks from a bus stop to your employment, people will drive. Or if they got to go from a restaurant, from work to classes real quickly, and the transportation timeline doesn't work for the bus situation, they're driving. So it hasn't gone away yet.
Mike?
I think the administrative reduction is important. We have areas with really high demand parking and really tight parking, but we have other areas that don't. Like, there's plenty of parking. There's no reason to require.
Or they're on a go line.
Or they're a single family zone that's really close to downtown and a grocery store, and like it's likely to have a renter that doesn't own a car, or both, or all 3 residents don't own a car.
I agree. And, you know, the city, in practice, the city applies the parking waiver, they have a parking waiver option for projects in the code already, which is a similar idea, and they're really good. I mean, this is just my experience. They're really good at using it when it's appropriate. You know, you can go in and say, there's all this parking on the street, and we studied it for 2 weeks, and there was 20 stalls available every day, and they'll give you a reduction, you know. So if you can prove it,
But like an area that has the parking pass required, they wouldn't do that because it's already crunch time.
yeah, exactly. Chris?
I wanted to make a correction, Mike. The parking stalls can be designed to be open space if you use grass grid, pavers, pervious pavers, stuff like that,
So
pervious
it's
concrete.
the impervious is the
Yes.
criteria for whether it's
Yes.
open.
Can you do a parking stall to meet code with like the grandma style? They call it the grandma strip. That's what I always called it, where it's like grass in the middle. It's like two.
Yes,
You can do that.
yes.
2 concrete strips in the grass. Sorry.
I agree with that we're not there yet, but I also agree that if we're mandating people building parking spots, we're never going to get there.
That's the
So
dilemma.
could we also, could we add language right in there? Could it be very clear that if you have 3 spots, I think about the Birchwood neighborhood, most of the parking, the driveways, my parents, I don't even want to see how many cars they have cluttering up the driveway, most of which don't work, but how many spots? Could there be something that if you already have 3 spots, that you don't have to add an additional spot, just so that's really clear?
That's what I was going to
It
ask.
doesn't,
No, I
yeah,
mean-
it doesn't need to be said. You're only required to have 2 parking stalls. If you have excess parking on site, that can accommodate the ADU.
Could it be right in here, though, too? Because I wouldn't have known that. Or will that
That's-
be really clear to someone wanting to build an ADU?
That's the way it is for anything,
Okay.
whether, it's not just ADUs. If you have excess parking on site and you want to expand your commercial building, you can expand your commercial building to the point where it's fully accommodated by that excess parking.
And if you came into the permit center, for example, to get information, you wanted to develop an ADU, staff would be capable of
Oh, yeah.
providing that. Because I think you're right. You don't want to like accidentally burden someone.
Right.
I imagine no one has accidentally built a parking spot they weren't required to.
Probably. No, I think you're safe. Yeah.
I would hope.
Okay.
Hey, there was one more, and this gets back to the maneuvering issue for accessory dwelling units that we are, and this appeared in the memo, but it's not in the attachments. And this regards citywide, whether or not this 10-foot setback requirement for when a garage door faces an alley. Staff is proposing that that be eliminated for all situations, not just for ADUs and detached ADUs and infill toolkit. It currently applies also to all infill toolkit housing types. We'd be looking to make this change across the board for all single family and multifamily. Because right now, you have a single-family home. It has a garage. You can build a detached ADU, but it's not going to be above the garage. Does that garage have to be designed for the allowance for the ADU, or does it have to be designed for the allowance for the primary residence now? So this would eliminate that inconsistency and just make it one consistent regulation across the board.
I think they should be consistent, and that allows flexibility for people in the future if they want to make a conversion. That makes sense.
Would they still need to have maneuvering room?
You're still required to have your 22 feet of
So you
maneuvering.
couldn't squeeze the maneuvering room?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
We got utilities left.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Do you know what the space is required to be considered maneuver, to be able to maneuver?
It's 22 feet of backup distance.
It's,
Is it 22 or 20, Chris?
So if you have a 12-foot alley, then would you have a
Yeah.
setback from that garage door?
Yes.
Okay.
yeah, so no matter what, you have to provide that maneuvering, and you can use the alley, but if the alley is not wide enough to accommodate all of it, you need to provide the balance on your property.
Is any part of the interior of the garage considered area to maneuver?
It would be based on the design, and so if you make a very deep garage, you also have to provide a turn
Wide.
radius.
Okay,
So,
just wondering, because,
So yeah, we skipped utilities, but that was just a one sentencer, right? Just that you can,
Yeah, we're not proposing any changes to the utility requirements.
So it says separate meters are allowed. Are they required to be separate meters?
they're not required. It's optional to do them separate.
Okay,
To
'cause
have
I
separate
sometimes
meters.
hear that there's there's a fee issue with the utility hookups for an ADU.
I want to talk about that.
Okay,
But-
I don't know. Go ahead.
Lisa had it.
same question, but a little further on that. As far as like water and sewer, when people are metered, I know that, and this you might not know, but the rate is, like if I have 100 gallons coming in, is my sewer rate determined based on how many gallons are coming in and exiting on that assumption? Or, I'm just trying to make sure that everybody pays their fair share. Or is there a base rate for sewer, and then you get charged for how much water you have coming in?
Yeah, it's a base rate for sewer.
Right.
We don't measure how much you're putting into this.
I didn't know if it's like, if this comes in, then that's what you're charged for going out?
Yes.
Would it make sense for cost sharing, then, that it would be a requirement that there would be a separate water sewer situation, so that these additional living units with additional bathrooms are paying their part for treatment?
So when you add additional fixtures, at time of building permit, you pay a fee for each additional fixture, whether it's sink, toilet, utility, room, washer, dryer, or washer. So you pay a utility hookup fee for
We
each
get you.
fixture.
We get you.
And then we would be, we're looking at a means of reducing fees in a similar fashion to what Portland is doing in order to incentivize ADUs. Because basically, ADUs are using existing infrastructure. They're not expanding cities' infrastructure, which once that infrastructure is built, now it's the city as a whole that maintains that added infrastructure. So there's many fiscal benefits to ADUs to use existing infrastructure.
And you do pay more per water consumed. We have metered watering now.
Yeah.
So, I just worry if an ADU goes in and it's like one person living there and it's really low usage, like to kind of mandate an extra charge for that. But if they are using a lot of water, you're going to pay a lot more in your water bill.
Yeah.
So it's dynamic relative to how much usage there is.
Following on that, just one quick question. I think we talked about this last meeting. I can't remember though. Impact fees. The city's proposing to charge impact fees for the ADU. That's a question.
We do charge transportation impact fees for ADUs.
But
And
no-
park. And park.
and
At a
parks.
multifamily rate.
In school.
Not school. School does not consider these as
Yeah.
contributing to school enrollment.
I'd like us to consider incentivizing the development of these by not charging the same park impact fee that you charge, the multifamily unit. Just feels like, you're telling someone they can only build a tiny little space, but you're going to charge them the same amount of money. So then that, relative to like the value of that unit, the impact fee is actually a greater cost to that ADU than it is to a multifamily unit or a single family unit for that matter. Does that make sense? If the park impact fee's $3,500 and it costs you $100,000 to build an ADU, that's 3.5% fee you're paying. And if it costs you $150,000 to build a multifamily unit, that's like a 2% fee. So you're punishing the ADU user with a higher percentage cost. And I just don't think that's, and like you said, you're already using the existing parks and stuff that we have. So I don't know, for me, I'd like to see if we could explore that a little bit further and find a way to reduce those park and traffic impact fees.
And we are looking at that. We're looking at what other jurisdictions are doing. I know Portland, as a means, again, to incentivize the building of ADUs, they waive impact fees. And so we are looking at that. And that was what I was alluding to earlier, is
Okay.
it's the impact fees.
Impact fees. I
Just
so,
keep,
thank you.
just keep in mind that we cannot waive impact fees. Somebody has to pay them.
Could we look
can
at?
reduce them.
Could we
Unless
look?
it's for affordable, it's for affordable housing, the big A, affordable housing. Somebody has to pay those fees.
We can, it'd be nice if we could see a mock-up of what a permit would look like and what the system development charges would be and the impact fees, because that's the other part of it too, right? Are we charging
No.
system development?
Unless
fees?
you choose to do a separate meter.
Yeah, unless you
Okay.
do separate
Okay.
services.
So, yeah, it'd be nice if we could just get a printout of, we've had permitted ADUs and we could see what the costs were. And then you guys could advise us on where those could be lessened. If we can't waive impact fees, we could reduce them. So.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Greg, is what you were speaking to an Oregon-Washington difference? That why is Portland able to do that and that's not an option?
It's a state law.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe it can be done. I just want to talk about it a little more.
Okay.
Iris?
I saw a suggestion out there. I couldn't find any jurisdiction that had actually done this, but I saw a lot of different suggestion and chatter about about the idea of providing some template, like building templates for a small fee to help reduce the costs of the planning for building an ADU, especially with the different types of regulations that are required, and how challenging that might be to wrap folks' heads around. If there was some little kit you could purchase with a plan from the city, I think it might help for some of the folks that are worried about design, neighborhood character, and it also might help incentivize the building and reduce costs.
It's an interesting idea.
It's pre-approved plans.
Yeah.
I believe Portland
Pre-approved plans.
does that.
What I was looking for.
Put Garrett out of work.
Put Shannon out of work. Okay. So we'll circle back to the Happy Valley pilot program at the commercial code meeting.
On 11/16, so we would
Yeah, our
probably
next-
start with ADUs, just get that done, and then go on to the commercial code. Public
Okay.
hearing on ADUs on 12/7, and then we have a meeting on 12/14, so we could use that as either a continuation of the hearing if we need to,
Or a
or a
work session.
follow-up work session.
Okay. Excellent.
Is it possible that we'll be moving the location of our
Mike,
on the potential of having quite a large,
We
we don't usually.
No, we do that
can't
sometime
because
with
we do-
city.
They are shown live, and we don't have the
Okay.
capability to do that in a larger room.
okay.
Yeah, and when we had the waterfront, for example, I mean, there were people packed,
Yeah,
lying in
Lotus
the room,
notices.
standing,
Made it
waiting in the
work.
hallway. So it's just,
All the time.
but, all right, well, okay, so we're going to close the work session. I want to thank Chris, Greg, and Heather for hanging out for 3.5 hours and listening to us debate all these topics and helping us. And I also want to thank the 3 audience members who stuck around and hung in there for that.
Okay, like those 3 of us, pretty sure we can have 5 minutes to talk.
No, I'm
Next
sorry, we
time.
can't do it. That
Next
wouldn't be fair
time.
to all those people who left. But I really appreciate you guys, staff, and also everybody. Good discussion, and this is what we have to do. And so I'm glad that nobody's afraid to do that and get into it and talk through these issues. And I felt like that was really productive.
Yeah, it was a really good meeting.
So, but thanks for hanging in there, and we won't do 10:30 again. I promise. Okay, with that, we'll adjourn.